Chapter 1229. The ground was littered with defeated soldiers. The previous battle seemed to have ended in a moment. Brando did not do much. He used his spatial elements to force the knight behind the guards to stay where they were. Then Phoenix's fire took care of the weak commoners one by one. Insursta and Tarkus only taught a lesson to a few blind people who crossed the line. When they sheathed their swords, there was only a pile of town guards on the ground looking for their teeth. What made the Knight of Rosaline not know whether to laugh or cry was that they were still pinned to the street by an invisible force. They could not even move a finger, let alone lift a foot. They could only watch their subordinates being beaten up. Like puppets, they were nailed to the corner of the street together with their wingless dragons in a row. It was as if they were the audience invited by these guys who had been beaten to a pulp. Apart from watching, they could also shout a few words. They had not thought of how to organize their lines for the time being, but this one-sided battle had already come to an end. The knight did not understand where the ghost god's power that locked them up came from, but this did not prevent them from using their brains to guess who was behind it. Except for a few people. For example, the short, dark-skinned knight who was still clamoring to show Brando, a country bumpkin, what a big scene was. He probably still thought that Brando was a lone traveler wandering in the wilderness and had never seen the power of human order and country organization. Insursta felt a little sad for the Lord of Rosaline. He was thinking about the reason why the Lord of Rosaline kept such a group of retarded subordinates. Even if they did not see what the wanted person looked like, they did not have the heart to find out why the person was wanted. "Do you want me to shut him up?" Tarkus asked elegantly from behind Brando. He was probably annoyed by this guy. Madara was a silent country. The noisy guys had probably been thrown into the abyss of eternal death long ago to feed the ice dragon. Under the dome of the Hall of Eternal Death, other than the footsteps of the dark nobles on the smooth obsidian floor, there was only the quiet breathing of the ice dragon. The undead would occasionally give their opinions to their eternal immortal queen, but they were concise and comprehensive. Brando shook his head. He would not do anything for such a small matter. Moreover, that person's words had no effect other than making him look bad. What a joke. What kind of grand spectacle had he not seen before? He had once chatted and laughed with the Twilight Dragon. Little Roman was so much more superior than these fellows. What a fool. Brando did not let go of these knights because he knew that they were only the vanguard of Lord Rosaline. Of course, calling them vanguard was too flattering. He had always suspected that these people did not coordinate well, so they appeared in front of him first. The ground trembled slightly from a few directions. He could easily sense that there was a large group of people surrounding this place through the mobilization of the nearby streets. He guessed that their original intention was to surround him and his group, then hand them over to Lord Rosaline. However, this somewhat complicated tactical arrangement was obviously difficult for these knight masters who were tactically trained in crews, or even in Erewhon, who could not even catch up with the local garrison. Although they were strong individually, they could only be regarded as a bunch of stragglers when gathered together. There was a huge difference between a group of headless flies and a group of soldiers. These knights who appeared in front of him inexplicably made the Lord's wish to surround him completely fail. Simply put, he could now walk out of the gap and leave behind a handsome back view for the people who caught up with him. However, Brando did not do so. Anyway, he wanted to see the Lord and see if he could persuade him to let the fleet of the Jade Phoenix family pass. After all, riding on the ghost ship of the dead was not a comfortable experience. He patted Huang Hua's tense shoulder to reassure her that she should not hold her sword so tightly. He felt that it was a pity that the sharkskin scabbard of the sword was wrapped with a beautiful layer of embroidery thread. Now, the thread was probably soaked by the sweat in the little girl's palms, and it was a pity that the sharkskin scabbard was wrapped with a beautiful layer of embroidery thread. "Mr. Brando." Huang Hua realized that she had lost her composure and hurriedly turned back to apologize to Brando. Although her strength was considered one of the best in Rosaline, she still had the mentality of a rookie. Even if she was calm, it was inevitable that she would overestimate the level of the enemy and treat every battle as a battle of life and death. Although such an attitude was not necessarily undesirable, it was too old-fashioned and dogmatic for a human to be fully focused and go all out to crush an ant. "You don't have to be so formal," Brando replied. He was somewhat optimistic about Huang Hua's sister. He and Yak were good friends, so he wanted to help her out on account of their relationship. Besides, Huang Hua was like a simple piece of beautiful jade. Anyone with the heart of a warrior would inevitably be tempted by her. Brando was completely convinced that with time, her achievements would be limitless. In the past, her name was not in the Amber Sword. Maybe it was because the Nine Phoenix was too far away, or maybe it was because her time had not yet come. He believed that once Huanghua appeared in the game she would be one of the top NPCs. She might not be inferior to names such as Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, Vara the Great Sage, and Veronica the Green Sword Saint. She might even be comparable to people such as Solomon and William. The idea that came to Brando's mind startled him. A mortal with the potential to surpass the Silver Folk? He massaged his temples and wondered if he had been thinking too much for the past few days. Why would he have such a strange thought for no reason? In the history of Wond, such a character had not been born. The average level of mortals was far below the Silver Folk, and the top of the mortals were often not as good as the top of the Silver Folk. Although the growth span of mortals was indeed the largest among the Silver and Gold Folk, their final position was far from the latter. Even after the Great Demonic Wave, this trend had only weakened, but it did not change. He could not help but take a closer look at Huanghua, as if he wanted to find some clues from this little girl. But he did not realize that his gaze was a little rude. Even Huanghua was blushing a little under his gaze. She wondered why Mr. Brando was looking at her so strangely. Fortunately, Mr. Liu was not here. Otherwise, he would probably think that Brando had some improper thoughts about their princess. Brando did have some improper thoughts about Huanghua, but it was not the improper thoughts that most people thought. It was the first time he had the idea of accepting a student. Although he promised to teach Petit Finesse swordsmanship in Buchi, and he did train him carefully for a period of time after that, it was limited to laying a foundation for the future for Petit Finesse and paving the way for his understanding of swordsmanship. First, it was because although Petit Finesse was talented, it was not to the point where he would be impressed. Second, the latter's personality was too different from his, and he should have his own path. But in Brando's eyes, Huanghua's talent was the same as the talent he had seen in the top warriors. It was as if she was born calm, and was born with an innate sensitivity to battle. In the Amber Sword there was a term for this kind of talent which was called fighting instinctively. It sounded a little like a beast, but it was indeed a beast. It was a battle full of wildness. For their opponents, it was often the most unpredictable and threatening battle. This kind of talent was something that could only be found by chance, but all warriors, regardless of whether they were born or acquired, would have some of it on them, including Brendel himself. But there was a world of difference between having it consciously and having it unconsciously. He had only seen one person like Huanghua who could naturally combine her innate calmness with her beast-like sharpness, and she did not even know it herself. To be exact, it was not a person. It was the Sky Dragon, Teoskraz, the strongest warrior in the history of the dragon race. Its partner was the one who was said to be close to becoming a god, the next successor of the dragon god. Yes, in Brando's eyes, Huanghua was a born warrior, but not a swordsman. Her path was not the path of fighting with a sword. The little girl may not have realized this herself, but Brando believed that one day she would understand it. He looked up. The tremors on the street were more obvious, and the night not far away was still like a puppet, unable to move. In the past, if he used his elemental power to freeze these living people, and they were living people with gold-level strength, his order points would have disappeared like the wind. But now, his order pool was standing still, which meant that he could freeze these people as if it was a natural reaction of the law, and he did not use much strength at all. This was the difference between having and not having the extreme planes. These people may not have understood that they had already fallen into the range of Brando's law domain. It was just that at the peak of the supreme realm, the law domain was integrated with the material world, and outsiders could not see it with the naked eye. If they had the strength of elemental awakening, they could have slightly noticed the difference, but unfortunately they did not. Chapter 1230. Among the people present, Phoenix, Hua, Insursta, and Tarkus could see the extreme plane that Brando had opened up, but other than the former who was carefully experiencing the power of the laws contained in it, the other two were seizing the time to silently calculate Brando's strength. The conclusion was quickly reached. Insursta's conclusion was obviously similar to Tarkus. The two looked at each other and secretly exchanged a look of joy. Late-stage Supreme Realm. This lord is really terrifying. He's only 22 years old, right? This was the first thought that flashed through Insursta's mind. But he immediately breathed a sigh of relief. But that was all there was to it. He was not even a sage and was nothing in front of the Mercury staff and the saints of the dead moon. This guy was going to fall for his evil trick. Thinking of this, the Black Lord was full of confidence. In his opinion, Brando was also an opponent of the same level. In terms of intelligence, he was still slightly inferior to him. When he brought Oderfeis and Howran Gaia back to the realm of eternal death, coupled with such an outstanding count, Her Majesty would definitely not mind having another capable general under her command. From then on, Another earth-shattering figure would be born among the dark nobles. And seeing that he had made such a great contribution, perhaps Her Majesty would not send him here to do hard labor because of that incident. The name Incersta should only be born on the battlefield and should only die on the battlefield. At least that was what he thought. But what this future star of Madara never thought was that Brando was incomparably aware of his thoughts at the moment, and was also snickering. After leaving the elemental barrier, thanks to the baptism of the great demonic tide, he had stepped into the late-stage Supreme Realm. Now he was only showing the strength of the Supreme Realm. No matter how one looked at it, Incersta and Tarkus could not see that he was faking it. In fact, he was not faking it. However, if they thought that his battle prowess was only at the late stage of the Lamita realm, then they were gravely mistaken. He knew very well that he was only one step away from becoming a sage. Many powerhouses of this era might not be able to take this step in their entire lives, but it was no secret to him. Even if these two racked their brains, they would not be able to figure out how a mortal could reach the sage realm. Although Brando guessed that the magic tide caused by the descent of the Twilight Dragon might have created several sages in Wonde, these two people had been staying in Rosaline, where birds did not lay eggs, so they might not know this. Furthermore, there was a huge gap between sages and sages. Otherwise, how could the sage of the earth, Iranta, use a token to scare Gwendolyn away? The biggest difference between the two was the understanding of the laws. The sage realm was the same as the extreme planes. Although it was also one of the 5 elemental realms, it was different from the gradual progression of the first 3 realms. These 2 realms were the 2 most special realms of the elemental realms. The extreme planes allowed mortals to have a godlike realm, and for the first time understood how the laws worked in this world. And the sage realm was a further deepening of this realm. To be precise, if the extreme planes was only a theory, then the sage realm was the way to use the extreme planes. How you understood your own extreme planes, how you understood your own laws and elements, and how your sage power could be expressed in the form of skills. Previously, he had shrouded the entire square with spatial power in the storm shadow in and accurately reflected all the arrows of the soldiers' back, and now he was using spatial power to effortlessly immobilize the knight. In fact, it was a manifestation of this way of operation. This was the conclusion he came to after studying his own elements and supreme power since the elemental barrier. It was also one of his biggest gains from this trip. But these were only the lowest level of expression. Brando believed that as long as he stepped into the sage realm with his control of the extreme planes, the power he would gain would definitely increase by 1,000 times. There was no other reason than that his power came from time and space. The power of existence. How could Iranta make the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn flee with just a look? It was because the Dragon Queen Gwendolyn was able to become a sage only because of her bloodline. To be precise, if she was not a dragon with her knowledge of the laws, she would never be able to step into this realm in her lifetime. The golden blood of the dragon race allowed the dragon race to step into the sage realm in the Age of Chaos after the War of the Holy Saints. This was just like how mortals could use stone slabs to perfect their bodies. But in the end, this was just an emergency path. It never had an end and there was no turning back. Once one chose, they would be completely cut off from the power of existence. Each of the 4 sages obviously relied on their own understanding of the laws to step into the path of the holy saints. Although the restrictions of the law of Tiamat that Martha left behind after the gods left finally stopped them at the checkpoint of the way of the perfect body, it was still not something that the Dragon Queen could compare with. The gods had already left the world. Now, it was no longer possible for a new god to be born in this world, including the legendary dragon Gwendolyn. She and Tyoskraz may have gone very far, but they would not go any further than the 4 sages. Brando looked at the scabbard of Odorfeis that was hanging on his waist, and vaguely felt where his path was. The only door opened by the 7 holy swords might be a road to the future. After that, there might really be a hidden mystery of the power of existence. But he had many questions in his heart. If the gods came to the world again, then wouldn't the efforts of the gods be in vain? Did the world really need a new god? Did the mortals really need a savior? He could not answer this question, but at least so far he only knew one thing, and that was that he still needed power. Very, very strong power. Power that could defeat the dusk. The guards who caught up from behind had begun to appear on both sides of the street. These guys had obviously once again made the mistake of their predecessors, and once again lost touch with the people behind them. But fortunately this time they were not so reckless. They had already seen their colleagues lying on the road on this side of the street. Some of these people had even experienced the battle in the afternoon. Fortunately, they were not shot in the knees by the arrows. At this time, naturally, they did not dare to come up to Brando easily. They only privately told their companions about the situation, and then conveyed it to the captain of the night behind them. In this way the teams on both sides finally slowed down, and stopped at the intersection on that side. What was even more fortunate was that Brando did not intend to trouble them. He silently looked at these people, thinking that it seemed that they had already found out where he was. But there was nothing strange about this. He and Phoenix Hua did not hide their whereabouts. Since Na Xen could find him, it would not be too difficult for the Lord of Rosaline to find him, as the biggest snake in Rosaline's territory. The idle people on the street had already run away as soon as he taught the guards a lesson. At this moment, except for him, Phoenix Hua, and the two future generals of Madara, there was only Na Xen and the dark-skinned boy behind him. Brando looked at the boy and said to Na Xen, "Na Xen, this is?" "His name is Seabass, the son of my friend," Na Xen quickly replied. Because of the uninvited guests, he was stunned for a moment and forgot about Seabass's recklessness. It was as if he suddenly recalled it, and he immediately broke out in cold sweat. However, he hesitated for a moment and said firmly, "Sir, my friend entrusted him to me to take care of him. Seabass is like my son. I did not discipline him well." Uncle Na Xen. The dark-skinned boy had watched a big show for free. At this moment he also understood why his uncle was so surprised at him. The way he looked at Brando was no longer as confident as before. Although Madame Delphine had given him unlimited courage, it was a pity that he was just a boy who had never left Rosaline. The most supreme existence he had ever seen was the lord of the castle. As for what kind of existence could easily beat up the lord's guards, it was no longer within his grasp. He could not help but lick his lips and replied dryly, "Sir, this has nothing to do with Uncle Na Xen. I was the one who wanted to find you because someone asked me to deliver a letter to you." "Someone asked you to deliver a letter to me?" Brando was stunned. "Was it Mr. Liu?" Seabass was also stunned. Who was Mr. Liu? However, Brando's amiable attitude finally gave him some courage. He took a breath and replied, "No, it was a lady, sir." "Lady?" Brando was really stunned this time. What kind of lady? Actually, what he wanted to ask was whether the other party was a person, a fox, or something else. However, he did not expect Seabass to shake his head vigorously. "I promised her that I would not reveal her name to outsiders. She might mention it to you in the letter, but before the letter is in your hands, I swear that I will not say a single word." As he spoke, he took out a locked diary and said to Brando, "She wrote what she wanted to write in this diary after page 177. After Seabass finished speaking, he read it again in the letter. After confirming that he did not say anything wrong or miss a single word, he carefully handed the diary to Brando. Brando took a look at the situation at the end of the street in the distance as he took the diary. He had never heard of White Fog writing a diary, and the style of this diary did not seem like something that a witch's spirit that had existed for over 1,000 years should possess. It was more like something that belonged to some noble's daughter. Brando did not expect that his casual guess would be so close to the mark. He took the diary in his hands. The lock was not a problem for him at all, and he opened it with a light swipe of his finger. He opened the diary, and it was at this moment that a group of people on horseback appeared at the end of the street not far away. Brando's eyebrows twitched. He was sure that he had seen Lord Rosaline among them. However, what surprised him was that among the knight by Lord Rosaline's side, there was actually a person who had surpassed the peak of the law and entered the supreme realm. This was somewhat out of his expectations. Chapter 1231. Brendel was a little surprised to see someone with the strength of a supreme realm standing beside the lord of a small place like Rosalind. Although the person's strength had not completely reached the extreme planes and should be lingering at the last stage of the peak of the law, it was a bit like Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles in the loop of trade winds. It could be said that the person was only half a step into the supreme state, but even so, it was enough to prove that the person was a genuine supreme being. He had seen the knight beside the Lord of Rosaline. Their individual strength was relatively strong, and their average standard was also very high. They were much higher than the great lords like Erwin, Arek, and Cypher, but they were barely on the same level as the Cruz Empire. However, a place like Rosaline in the Empire was probably only equivalent to a remote place like Anzaruta. The people were equally tough, and the distribution of strength was uneven. The strength of the ordinary people was similar to that of most places in Erwin, but the strength of the knight and adventurers was obviously higher. However, even in a place like Anzaruta, he had never heard of a lord having a supreme being as his follower, not even a semi-supreme being. First of all, how could the local lord have a supreme being serving him? The number of supreme beings in the entire empire was less than 10. Including those who lived in seclusion, there were no more than 20 of them. How many lords were there in the empire? Excluding those knights who had a few pieces of knight's salary, there were at least hundreds or thousands of them. Secondly, most people could not afford to raise a lemeter. If a lemeter wanted to continue walking down this path, they would need to consume countless resources. Take Lu Yin for example. If he had not been lucky enough to experience the baptism of the great demonic wave, he would not have been able to reach this step so quickly. However, outside of the law of Tiamat, how much pure magic was brought by the tide set off by the sea of magic? If it was converted into magic crystals and other similar products, how many magic crystal mines did Wand have to support such consumption? Not to mention just his nominal teacher, Grey Sword Saint Mephistopheles, alone consumed 1/5 of the magic crystals produced in the Black Forest every month. The same amount was almost half of the consumption of the entire Valhalla fleet. One person was equivalent to half of the floating fleet. How many lords could afford to raise a supreme being? If Brando did not have the ability to exploit the resources in the Black Forest with the druids, perhaps the Abes would not have been able to keep his nominal teacher for long. Of course, this did not exclude the possibility that some supreme beings were the protectors of smaller duchies or kingdoms, or even members of the royal family of the kingdom or duchies with high seniority. Out of the need to protect their descendants and foundation, they might not care about personal gains and losses and stay in a barren land for a long time. Even if this choice was not beneficial to their pursuit of the law and power, these people would often give up on the desire to continue on this path. They would put more thought into the pursuit of worldly power, and it would be difficult for them to improve their strength. After all, after the Supreme Realm was a vast and boundless road. Since the War of the Holy Saints, almost no one could take the next step to reach the Sage Realm, so there were many people who chose this path. However, Brando did not think that the middle-aged man in front of him was such a person. First of all, the man had nothing to do with the Rosaline family because no matter how one looked at him, he did not look like a native of Rosaline. To be precise, the man was a foreigner. He had light brown hair, light blue eyes, deep-set eyes, a high nose bridge and fair skin. At first glance, one could tell that he was a typical Wand person. Brando also judged that the man should be from the southern part of the Cruz Empire, the descendant of Anzaruta and the Grey Mountain people in the Grey Mountain area. The Erewhon people there had been mixing with the people of the Empire for a long time, thus forming a special race. How could such a person walk together with the Lord of Rosaline? He suddenly remembered that XN seemed to have said that the #1 guard captain of Rosaline was a foreigner. He claimed to be from Cruz and seemed to be called Bobin or something. However, Brando felt that this name did not sound like a Cruz person's name, but more like an alias. The moment Brando saw this person, he released the suppression on the knight in front of him. It was not a wise thing to take the initiative to open the extreme planes in front of an opponent of the same level, and he did not want to be as stupid as Williams. Normally, only wizards would take the initiative to pull their opponents into their extreme planes, because to them, the extreme planes was only a means to establish a home ground advantage. They trusted their magic more and magic was the only way to win. The Rosaline Knights suddenly felt that the power that was shackling them was no longer restrained. Caught off guard, they almost lost their balance and fell off the saddles of the wingless dragons. Even so, these knights were so frightened that they sprawled on the saddles, as if they were not gold rankers, but ordinary people who had never ridden a horse before. They made a fool of themselves. These knights were sweating profusely, and their faces were a little ugly. They knew that the Lord of Rosaline was looking in their direction, and from his gloomy expression, it was obvious that he was not satisfied with their performance. Fortunately, Bobin acted to stop his lord. He was also sizing up Brando. In fact, this guard captain was not as calm as he appeared on the surface. The moment Brando released the suppression on the knights, he knew that this young man's strength was a little terrifying. This terrifying meant that it was beyond his imagination. This was a genuine Supreme Class fighter, and he might not even be in the middle or early Supreme Class. When Brando opened the extreme planes, Bobin did not see what it looked like. To be able to integrate the Supreme Class with the material world was something that only the late Supreme Class could do. However, the late Supreme Class was a broad range and it was hard to say how far the late Supreme Class could go. Bobin had some confidence in dealing with ordinary Supreme Class fighters, and he was not completely helpless against those in the middle or late Supreme Class. Even though he was only half as strong as a Supreme Realm warrior now, that was only because of the scars left on his body from the passage of time and his injuries. When he was at his peak, a young man like Brendel would at most surprise him. However, to think that there was such a genius in this era, Bobin felt a little emotional. He thought that the turbulent era that he had experienced was already Wand's most glorious era. In the decades after that, the names of the past faded away one after another. The empires seemed to have sunk into a long period of depression. The great era before the war that made people's hearts surge was gone forever. All that was left was the reminiscence of the past. He thought that the mortal kingdoms would sink into a long period of depression, but he did not expect that after half a century, such a genius would be born on this land again. There was more than one of them. The two spirits of the dead behind Brando, and the little girl standing beside them, were all reflected in Boban's eyes. Although the talents of the Insursta dragon and Tarkus could not compare to Brando's cheat-like strength, they were still considered top-notch among ordinary geniuses, especially the Black Lord of Madara. Although he was a spirit of the dead, he was only about the same age as Brando. As for Phoenix Fire, Brando felt that if it was not for the system's endorsement, he would have been left behind by her by dozens of streets. Before seeing these people, Boban thought that he should have thrown away everything in the past. He had left Wone for 9 Phoenix, and left the land that he had always yearned for to come here for nearly half a century. Old Rosaline had helped him when he was at his lowest, and he had always thought that he would protect this somewhat ruined family because of this kindness. At least that was how it seemed to him. Until 100 years later, he had guarded his own secret and left this world. But today, the young man standing in front of him seemed to have regained his desire for the truth. He knew that he did not have much time left, but for a moment, the thought of becoming a spirit of the dead had ignited in his heart. The shock in his heart did not come from Brando's strength and talent. It was his face. It was a typical face of the Erewhon people. He was slightly handsome, but next to the Insursta dragon and Tarkus, he was not worth mentioning. Everyone knew that the Insursta dragon was one of the 3 most handsome men in the Roman Empire, the other 2 being Tarkus and Latios. Next to them, Brando seemed to be overshadowed. Mr. Boban, the little girl beside this young man should be the one that the ghost chariot is looking for. They should have an accomplice, but I don't know where he went. Lord Rosaline was not stupid. He knew the strength of his knight subordinates. Brando was able to toy with these people like playing monkeys. Obviously, his strength was not proportionate to his youth. He also knew the strength of his subordinates, so even if Boban did not stop him, he would not act rashly. His knight subordinates were not worth mentioning, but the Rosaline family could not produce any more convincing force. This was indeed a ruined family. Ever since his father passed the position of the head of the family to him, or rather, ever since the Rosaline family failed in the Swift Plains and migrated here, it had become an established fact. Fortunately, he still had someone to rely on. He knew how powerful the nominal captain of the guards beside him was. He was not actually a retainer of the Rosaline family, but had stayed here to take care of his descendants because of his father's kindness. Chapter 1232. Lord Rosaline had no idea how powerful the other party was, but he knew that the other party was very, very powerful. The knights under his command were no match for the other party. Otherwise, those lawless fellows would not have allowed such an outsider to be the captain of the guards for so long. He only remembered one time when he saw the other party attack. His most powerful knight couldn't even last one move against the other party. In fact, the other party only glanced at him casually, and that knight was defeated without a fight. From then on, he treated the guard captain as the guardian of the family. Not only did he treat him with the highest respect, but he was also on the same level as him in the castle. Fortunately, this person did not seem to care about fame and was loyal to the Rosaline family. Countless experiences had proven his reliability, and Lord Rosaline had always treated him as his last support. For example, in a situation like this, he had no choice but to let the other party attack. However, Boban was hesitant. This lord's strength was very weak and he might not know this, but he thought that his knight subordinates should know. He usually only displayed the strength of an end state, which was Wone's peak level of law. There was still a gap between him and the 9-headed Phoenix's extreme power. If he wanted to fight with Brando, he would have to use the strength of an extreme state. Even so, he was worried that he might not be able to gain an advantage over the other party. However, this battle was inevitable. Boban only hesitated for a moment before making up his mind. A thought that seemed to have been silent in his heart for decades rose uncontrollably at this moment. He turned around and said to Lord Rosaline, "The other party is very strong. You guys back off a little. I might have to go all out." Lord Rosaline's heart could not help but beat faster when he heard this. He subconsciously asked, "How strong is the other party? Are you confident? Should we just let it go? After all, we only agreed to help the ghost chariot find someone. Now that we have found him, the rest is up to the other party. There is no need for us to offend such a strong enemy." It wasn't that he was afraid of that young man, but he had always regarded Boban as the family's barrier and was afraid that something would happen to him. Furthermore, the Rosaline family was about to return to the Swift Plains. Their enemies from the Swift Plains had already defeated the Rosaline family a few hundred years ago. Now, the disparity in strength between the two parties had grown even larger after the uneven development. The only reason he dared to make such a decision was because he had the backing of the other party. But Boban looked at him and said, "Don't do anything superfluous, my lord. Besides, your knight is nothing in the eyes of the other side. He's not an enemy. I might be acquainted with that young man. Maybe he can help you." "He's your friend?" Lord Rosaline was elated. He knew how powerful Brando was. His knight had been pinned to the ground like a puppet. Even if Brando was a sorcerer, how powerful would a sorcerer be to be able to pin 7 or 8 gold-level knights to the ground? "You can understand it even if you think with your knees." Boban still shook his head. "It could be a descendant of an old friend, but I still need to confirm it." "How do you confirm it?" Lord Rosaline immediately shut his mouth. He had already sensed the answer. The aura of the guard captain beside him was rising steadily, and the pressure from the other party made him almost unable to stand beside him. He could not help but turn pale with fright as he turned the reins around so that the warhorse beneath him could run further away. After running for more than 10 meters, Lord Rosaline finally felt that he could breathe again. He could not help but pant heavily as he looked in that direction with a pale face. Then he realized that it was not only him. The few knight who had been following him had also been suppressed by Boban's aura and had no choice but to run back. The leading knight looked even more shocked than him, as if he had lost his soul. He said to him in a daze, My lord, Mr. Boban's strength? What's wrong with his strength?" "Extreme strength." Lord Rosaline suddenly felt the world spin. Even though he was not strong and could not tell how terrifying Boban's strength was, it did not prevent him from understanding who was at the peak of the 9 phoenixes and who the Rosaline family could not afford to offend. The most important thing was that all the families and lords who lived in the Swift Plains had to understand. There was a group of people who stood above the clouds in this world. Their name was the Extreme. The Extreme. The Extreme Plains. In this era, in this world, the peak of power for mortals. Brando had been on high alert for a long time. Regardless of whether it was the Extreme or half a step to the Extreme, they were all on the same level as him. He was actually a little careless because he never expected that a mere Rosaline would have an extreme existence. It was no wonder that Xin and the scavengers had different tones when they talked about the guard captain. He thought that even if it was the extreme strength of an extreme elemental, the suppression of a gold-ranked expert would not be as severe as he had imagined. He might have an absolute advantage in a one-on-one fight, but it would be very difficult for him to fight one-on-one. At that time, he only thought that this middle-aged man called Boban was in existence on the same level as Mr. Liu. If that was the case, a late elemental truth expert who was half a step to the peak of the law would be able to dominate a place like Rosaline. Even so, he felt that it was a little too abrupt. Lord Rosaline did not look like someone who could gain the favor of an elemental truth expert or above. He never expected the guard captain to be an extreme-level expert who was on the same level as him. He saw that the middle-aged man had a short conversation with the Lord of Rosaline. He saw that the other party could not help but look at him with a slightly fearful gaze. It seemed that the other party was confirming something. As for what he was confirming, it was obvious that he was confirming Phoenix was identity. Otherwise, the other party would not have mobilized so many people just because he had caused a ruckus in Storm Shadow. Even the Lord himself had appeared here personally, not to mention an extreme-level expert. Previously, when he had destroyed the Silver Queen's plan in the Empire had only mobilized an extreme-level expert. It was clear that extreme-level experts were not as common as cabbages in the fields. As expected, the middle-aged man raised his head after a short while. Then Brando felt that he had been locked onto by the other party's mental probing. An inexplicable feeling swept across his body. Brando's heart skipped a beat, and he quickly retracted his aura. He vaguely felt that something was wrong. The other party had obviously used an ability similar to his in-depth analysis. It was a technique to probe the other party's level of strength. However, he actually felt that he had recognized the ability that the other party had used for a moment. That was the secret of the Erwin royal family, the rarest move of the White Raven sword arts. Mirror still water. Black Tea had this ability, and Brando had experienced it more than once when he had practiced with her. Moreover, other than Black Tea, Brando knew that there was another person who had often experimented with this technique on him. That was his grandfather, the sacred swordsman Darius, who had also received special permission to learn the Erwin royal family's White Raven sword arts in depth. Brando instantly became alert. He placed his hand on the hilt of Flaming Blade Odorfice. In a battle between two extreme-level experts, probing was often the first step. After probing, it would be a fierce attack. He could acutely sense that the other party was trying to capture the elemental information contained in his extreme planes. Fortunately, he was the most vigilant about this, so before the other party could react, he had completely retracted the line of precepts into his body. However, before Brando could feel satisfied with his performance, he suddenly felt a strong sense of danger. This sense of danger came out of nowhere, and it had nothing to do with his current thoughts and judgment. It was as if it was an instinct that came from decades of battle experience in his previous life. Not good. Brando suddenly realized that he had made a mistake. The other party did not use the Mirror of Tranquility to probe his extreme planes. To be precise, the other party deliberately let him feel that he wanted to do so. This was because he had already seen the light blue eyes of the middle-aged man named Boban flash with an incomparably dangerous glint. He was very familiar with that glint. It was like the cold glint in the eyes of a hunter when he was hunting his prey. He wanted to trick him into retracting the line of precepts into his body. He wanted to attack. Brando felt his scalp tingle. He thought that he had been cautious enough, but he did not expect to teach the other party a lesson. Taking the initiative to withdraw the line of precepts meant that the other party could not detect the composition of his extreme planes. But at the same time, it meant that he had taken the initiative to give up the advantage of using the extreme planes. In a battle between two extreme sword saints, very few people would take the initiative to use the extreme planes to pull the other party into their own domain. This was because for an opponent of the same level, it was not only time-consuming but also not very effective. It was also full of unpredictable dangers. This was because one could not know if the other party could attack one's extreme planes. The last person who had made such a low-level mistake was Williams, whom Brando had met before. After that, there was no after. A dignified extreme sword saint had died so sullenly at the hands of an ant whose strength was who knew how many streets below him. At least, that was how Williams saw Brando's strength at that time. And at that time, Williams was still bullying Brando, and it was impossible for him to be a threat. But now, this middle-aged man named Boban was simply lawless. Brando almost instantly had the subconscious thought of taking out the god-slaying magic-breaking all. But he stopped himself from doing so. It was not because it would be too wasteful. When dealing with a supreme realm powerhouse, no matter what method he used, it would not be wasteful. Any master of this level absolutely required him to go all out. But it was because the warning signs in his heart told him that if he did so, he would definitely die. Fortunately, his rich experience allowed him to escape this disaster. Brando chose to follow his battle instincts because he knew that he was still a warrior, a good warrior with a beast-like intuition. As soon as the flames appeared, the Flaming Blade Odorfice had already appeared in Brando's hand. Then he saw a long and narrow bright light. At that moment, Brando was so scared that he almost bit off his tongue. Flash strike sword art. His heart was filled with shock. If a moment ago he still did not think much of it, but at this moment he already understood that the middle-aged man in front of him was definitely not an ordinary person. He even guessed that the other party's strength was definitely not at the peak of the half-step. At least, it was not at this level in the past. It was very likely that for some reason he had regressed to this level. At his peak, the other party was definitely a peak supreme realm powerhouse who was comparable to him. It was not just the level of strength. It was also the experience. At least at that moment, he felt that he had met an opponent who was at the same level as he was in his previous life. The feeling of danger when the sword was drawn was definitely an ability that only a top-level warrior could have. But why did the other party also know the Flame King's flash strike sword art? Clang. The two swords clashed. It was clearly dusk, but Brando clearly saw a spark extending in the darkness. P.S. I just noticed that the tweets were blocked. I really didn't expect it. Speaking of which, it's already the 21st. I don't know if there will be double votes around the 1st of October. Let's ask for next month's votes first. Chapter 1233. Flash Strike Sword Art. In terms of familiarity with Flash Strike Sword Art in this world, Brando wouldn't dare to say that he was one of the best, but he was definitely one of the best. His Flash Strike Sword Art was not complete, but the Cruz people had lost even more. The Cruz royal family had not produced a sword saint for many generations, and this sword art was only passed down in the Flame Family Knight Regiment. Just like their pursuit of power, the dragons always liked to reach the extreme in one direction, and as part of the dragon inheritance, The Flame King's Flash Strike Sword art also had the characteristics of unparalleled destructive power and extreme speed. So in this world, the best way to deal with Flash Strike Sword art was to use Flash Strike Sword art to attack. Using speed to fight speed was the only way, and other sword arts were slightly inferior. Of course, this didn't mean that Flash Strike Sword art was the strongest sword art in the world, but because of its own characteristics, once the opponent used Flash Strike Sword art first, the best countermeasure was still Flash Strike Sword art. Brendel's hand was almost at the position of the Flash Strike Sword art, but his mind was like lightning, and in the end he suppressed his almost instinctive thoughts. The battle of the Flash Strike Sword art was probably one of the most gorgeous swordsmanship duels in the world. It was indeed gorgeous, and he was confident that he could suppress the swordsman opposite him. The middle-aged man had given him a big surprise, but Brendel himself wasn't any worse. After a brief moment of surprise, he calmed down. Every step of his opponent's plan was calculated perfectly. Only the best warriors he had seen in his previous life would have such a keen sense of the battle. Unfortunately, God's plan was not as good as man's. His opponent had made a mistake in the end. He probably never thought that his opponent would also know Flash Strike Sword art. Just like how Brando didn't expect him to know Flash Strike Sword art. Brando took a step back. The flaming blade in his hand was whimpering softly, as if responding to the burning fighting spirit in his heart. When the light of the Flash Strike Sword art lit up, the eyes of a little girl holding a long sword were reflecting the bright light of the sword. She was motionless as if she was enchanted. Although Huang Huo was born in the Nine Phoenix royal family, the Jade Phoenix clan had a strict upbringing. Coupled with the fact that she was the successor of the Jade Phoenix mage, she had never lived a luxurious life. At most, she had never had to worry about food or clothing. In her limited memories, in the first 10 years of her life, the only things that accompanied her the most were the ascetic cultivation and swordsmanship. The Nine Phoenixes established their country with swords. She had seen many genius swordsmen, legendary swordmasters, and stunning swordsmanship. Most of her memories were of dazzling sword lights and sword shadows intertwining, weaving a dream that belonged to a young girl. She gripped the sword in her hand tightly. The dream in her heart was to reach the peak of this path. The apex of a swordsman. What kind of swordsmanship was the top swordsmanship in the world? The swordsmanship masters in the Nine Phoenix secret land often said that the skill was close to the Tao. Then what kind of swordsmanship could be called the Tao? Legend had it that the desert wind swordsmanship that she learned was a divine skill that was close to the Tao. After the Red Lotus Sword of Hellfire reached the 9th level, it could easily destroy the world. However, level 9 swordsmanship was only a legendary existence. The Nine Phoenix Empire had been established for thousands of years. Even the sages who stood in the clouds only had a few level 7 or level 8 swordsmanship that had been passed down for generations. Huang Hua often thought that the legendary Red Lotus Sword of Hellfire existed in the world of stagnation. What kind of existence was the strongest swordsmanship of the desert wind swordsmanship, which was called the Phoenix Technique? But at this moment she suddenly understood something. There was such a swordsmanship in this world. It was as bright as light and as fast as lightning. It was clearly the first cry of the birth of the world. However, when the light came out of the box, what she saw was not the brilliance of the birth of all things, but a wild and unruly red flame that seemed to break free from all shackles. Once the flame burned, it pressed forward as if it was going to burn the earth. It was so resolute that it made people feel convinced. Just by looking at this sword, she could understand the spirit contained in this sword. It was indomitable, and it was only born to resist everything. This was the sword of a warrior. Huang Hua suddenly understood that she might never reach such a level in her life. The sword in her hand could not respond to the feelings in her heart. It was as if it was a dead object. She was already in the elemental realm, but the sword in her hand only had the nirvana flame of the desert wind lineage. She could not feel the existence of her own law. That was not her sword. It was not even her path. The little girl bit her moist lower lip tightly. Her eyes were bright and she did not say a word. She was even a little distracted. She could not help but think, if I was under this sword, how would I resist? How would Mr. Brando fight back under this sword? In contrast, the reactions of Insursta and Tarkus were much smaller. Although for them the Flash Strike Sword art was also a legendary thing, sometimes, when their thoughts were too complicated, the world they saw and the realizations they gained were much less. Although the Flash Strike Sword art made them raise their eyebrows, the two of them, especially the former, were more concerned about Brando's reaction. They knew that the young Lord Erwin also knew the Flash Strike Sword art. Sinclair stood in place. Such a battle had long exceeded the scope of his understanding. He did not understand, nor did he need to understand. He could only pray that the young man could withstand the attack of the guard captain Boban. He did not expect Brando to fight back. He had long known that the guard captain beside the Lord was powerful, but he did not expect him to be so powerful. He did not know what the flash strike sword art was, but that did not mean that he did not understand what the law of space meant. Seabass and the other knights' eyes widened. They were usually closer to the guard captain beside the Lord, including the dark-skinned young man. Most of them only knew Boban as a taciturn, serious and rigid man. He was loyal to the Rosaline family, but he rarely relied on his status to ask for anything. He was even more austere than most knights. He did not pursue pleasure, but he did not seem to be an ascetic swordsman. He lived in seclusion and did not have any requirements for power, money or beauty. In the eyes of others, the guard captain could be regarded as a strange person. Like most of the knights in the manor, Seabass only knew that this mister was very strong, but as for how strong he was, he had only heard about it through hearsay. He had only heard bits and pieces of hearsay from the knights. He was much stronger than the other knight and even the knight captain. Those swordsmen who were at the celestial realm had to behave themselves in front of Boban. In Seabass's mind, this guard captain was probably such a person. In Rosaline he was strong enough to hold his own, but that was it. Even if this young man, who was not very knowledgeable, used all of his imagination, he probably would not have imagined that the skill of the Lord's guard captain would be at the top of the world in Swift Plains, Nine Phoenix, or even the whole of Wonde. Boban's sword was not only reflected in Brando's eyes. The moment he drew his sword, he had also blinded the knight and the Rosaline Lord. Supreme Realm. The Supreme Realm. That person is dead for sure. Seabass felt that it was a pity. The other party had not even read Miss Delphine's letter. He did not know if his mission was completed. He did not know how to tell that beautiful and gentle lady about this. Could it be that the person you sent the letter to was killed by the Lord's guard captain before he could read the letter? He then became nervous again. The diary was still on that person. He hoped that the Lord would not search his belongings. He did not know if Miss Delphine would be implicated. At this moment he was not the most worried about himself. However, what Seabass was thinking at this moment was indeed what most people were thinking. That person is dead for sure. Rosaline's thoughts were even more complicated. He was more knowledgeable than Seabass, and the boundaries of his imagination were also wider. However, his greatest fantasies and expectations for the Rosaline family did not include the possibility of his guard captain suddenly becoming a Supreme Realm expert. He was both surprised and happy, but he could not help but worry. In his position he had to consider the problem from another perspective. For such a person to hide his strength and stay in the Rosaline family, acting as if he had no desires, why? Was it really because of the favor that his father had given him? Would a Supreme Realm expert be lacking in such a small thing? These messy thoughts were mixed up in his mind, making him unable to pay attention to what was happening in front of him. It was only when one of his subordinates tugged at his sleeve, the knight did not dare to tug at the arm of their lord, that he reacted. He subconsciously asked, "That person was defeated? Go and bring that little girl over. Remember, don't touch her. Her status is much higher than you guys." He said weakly, "Also let Master Boban come over. I have something to say to him." "Forget it. It's better if you guys take me to see him." "My lord." The knight's voice was a little awkward. "What are you waiting for?" The Rosaline's lord could not help but feel a nameless anger rising in his heart. He really could not guess what his guard captain was planning. It seemed that the only thing worth the Rosaline family's attention was that thing. Ever since that thing had been discovered, whether it was the people from the ghost chariot or the people around him, they had all flocked over like sharks that had smelled blood. How could the small Rosaline family tolerate these gods? Chapter 1234. In fact, he didn't want to participate in the battle between Yufeng and Ghost Chariot, but the strange creatures in the Rosaline wilderness were eyeing his life. Those people seemed to have realized this as well. If he didn't agree, wouldn't the Rosaline family have to wait for death on the other side of the Taiga Strait? Back at the Swift Plains. That was the hard work of the Rosaline family for many years. The fat on his face couldn't help but tremble. He knew that he wasn't someone who could achieve great things, and he wasn't even as wise as his father. Sometimes, it was like holding a knife to a person's neck, and he had no choice but to make such a choice. "Forget it, I'll take one step at a time." After the helpless anger in his heart, the Rosaline overlord was a little disheartened. He raised his head and saw a familiar face. "Isn't this the young man just now?" He was stunned for a moment, then screamed as if he had seen a ghost. He was so frightened that he fell from the horse's back and fainted on the spot. The Overlord's knight instantly became agitated. They hurriedly yelled and pulled this ridiculously fat guy up from the ground. Brando stood in front of these people and looked at this chaotic scene speechlessly. He thought to himself, am I that scary? He shook his head and turned around. Bobin, who was holding his bloody right arm, stood beside him and looked at him helplessly. His overlord was, after all, an ordinary person. After all, the Rosaline family had been content with their territory for such a long time. It was understandable that he hadn't seen a person of this level. Mr. Bobin. Brando ignored the noisy knight and asked calmly, is what you said true? The guard captain revealed a bitter smile. Young master, you probably don't understand the prestige Lord Darius had in the Allied forces in that era. You said that you had once caused a commotion in the Empire. In fact, if you had taken the official route, there would definitely be many people in the Empire who would be willing to help you behind your back. Lord Deputy Marshal, don't call me that. It makes me uncomfortable. The middle-aged man smiled. I'm no longer the Deputy Marshal of the Allied forces. Besides, I'm not from the Empire. After I gave the title of Grand Duke to my eldest son, I no longer have anything to do with the Empire and the Holy Cathedral of Fire. I'm just a follower of Lord Darius. As his successor, you deserve to be addressed as such. Moreover, your strength is worthy of my recognition. Brando smiled bitterly. He never dreamed that this man would have such an identity. If the other party had not called out his identity at the last moment, he would have killed him with his sword. What he did not expect was that he would be able to fight against the Deputy Marshal of the Holy Cathedral of Fire's allied forces in Rosaline, which was tens of thousands of miles away from Wonde. In the Holy War half a century ago, the allied forces of the Holy Cathedral of Fire only had one commander, and that was Darius, his grandfather. Other than him, the person with the highest status in the allied forces should be the Silver Princess Constance, who was Darius's right-hand woman. However, the allied forces were made up of dozens of large and small duchies and kingdoms, including the connections between the different armies. Of course, it was impossible for these two people to support the entire command system. For the armies of this era, the Holy Cathedral of Fire also used a relatively backward system to ensure that there were no problems with the overall command and communication between the troops. That was to select a member of the royal family or a member of the most powerful family in a kingdom or dukedom who was outstanding in strength and prestige to serve as the secondary commander of these troops. Although this command system was backward and inefficient, it was surprisingly effective in ensuring communication between the armies. After all, under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, most of the nobles in the kingdoms had a harmonious relationship with each other, and most of them had private dealings with each other. Coupled with their own prestige in their own countries, they were able to suppress the voices and dissatisfaction of the armies sent out by their own countries. In this way, even though the command system was chaotic and complicated, Saint Tassol and Fanzan were not much better in comparison. In a situation where everyone's movements were slow, they could just sit down and fight their own battles. After all, the nobles did not care how many people died. However, among these nominal commanders, not all of them were just nominal commanders. In fact, in the vast land under the rule of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, there had always been geniuses and strong people regardless of the era. Outside of the Cruz Empire, there were also people who shone like new stars. His grandfather, Darius, was not an exception. Even within the Erwin Empire there was also Tulman, an anomaly. The kingdom of Erwin had never been special in Wonde. Although it was the most dazzling jewel on the crown of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, under the rule of the Cruz Empire, there were also many duchies and kingdoms of various sizes. These duchies and kingdoms were all outstanding people, including the members of the royal family and the Grand Duke, and a total of more than 10 deputy marshals were chosen. And Bobin was one of them. In fact, Brando was not unfamiliar with his original identity and name. Bobin was actually the grandfather of the nun Princess Magadol, the father of the current Grand Duke of the Antiburo Duchy, the previous Grand Duke, and one of the most famous deputy marshals of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. White Wolf Blademaster 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 Blademaster, the third strongest person in the Cruz Alliance. After hearing the other party's identity, Brendel couldn't help but break out in cold sweat. Fortunately, the other party left Vaunt disheartened because his grandfather was convicted for no reason. Coupled with the fact that his strength had decreased due to his injuries in the Holy War, if the other party was still at his peak. If he was still at his peak, Brendel might not be able to win against him. His current strength was much higher than the peak of the Supreme Realm, but on the basis of his understanding of the law of the Sage Domain, if it was just based on swordsmanship, Blademaster's flash strike sword art might have really made him suffer. Obviously this old sword saint also saw this point. First, he used the mirror of still water to deceive Brendel into subconsciously withdrawing his law, and then used the flash strike sword art to force Brendel to only use his swordsmanship. If not for his strong foundation and the fact that Blademaster's strength was not at his peak, the outcome of the battle would have been hard to predict. Fortunately, everything had been decided. Thinking of this, Brando suddenly vaguely felt something. He followed the gaze that fell on his face and saw the little girl named Huang Hua staring at him. Her black eyes were full of admiration. He was slightly stunned as if he saw the battle between him and Blademaster from her eyes. It was a shocking battle between two swordsmanships. Perhaps it was a scene that could only be seen 1,000 years ago, but at this moment, it was repeated in this land so far away from Wonde. When Bobin's flash strike sword art was unsheathed, there was only a moment left for him to react. His choice was to retreat. But it was not just retreat. He took a step back but left a phantom in place. The phantom's face was blurry, but its figure was exactly the same as him. Its 5 fingers were slightly open, and a long sword with golden flames flowing like a blazing flame appeared in its hand. It pulled the sword and drew a circle in the air. With a clang it collided with Bobin's sword. This was the second sword. Brando seemed to be unable to resist and began to retreat. When Huang Hua saw this scene she could not help but blurt out, but she immediately blushed and covered her mouth, realizing that she had lost her composure. The rigid education of the 9 Phoenix royal family made Huang Hua ashamed of her rudeness. This was not how a descendant of the Jade Phoenix should behave. It was just that this sword was too wonderful. She was not talking about Brando's sword, but Bobin's sword. Bobin's flash strike sword art was like a raging wave, as if he had found a way to break through Brando's retreat. His sword was flat and vertical, simple and direct, but he did not give his opponent any chance to breathe. That was the fire of vengeance that burned out, unreasonably wild. But Huang Hua frowned at Brando's sword. She could not reach the peak of swordsmanship, but this did not mean that her understanding of swordsmanship was low. On the contrary, her knowledge and talent had long made her understand this battle better than most people present. Even Insursta and Tarkus were present. To be honest, Huang Hua was a little disappointed with Brando's swordsmanship. Although it was average and barely blocked Bobin's amazing swordsmanship, but that was it. If she continued to think like this, she could see that Brando would definitely not win. She clenched the sword in her hand, silently preparing to attack. Although such a battle was not something she could intervene in, the path of the Jade Phoenix did not abandon her allies and run away. But it was at this moment. A dazzling verdant brilliance came into her eyes. It was Brando's second sword. This sword move had conquered everyone present. On the azure sword, the azure sea, the azure sky, the dream of Faya and Malurcha, and Miss Tada's lifelong wish were reflected. The azure sky was like a dream, the sea and the sky were a line. The phantom holding the frost chancina and the phantom holding the flaming blade, one on the left and one on the right, attacked Bobin. The 2 sacred swords of completely opposite attributes intertwined with fire and ice, one blue and one red, like 2 jumping parallel lines. They appeared in front of everyone's eyes. The 2 swords intertwined, and it was as beautiful as an illusion. Bobin's expression changed. Very few people knew that there was once a swordsmanship in this world that was on par with the flash strike sword art. Its name and its creator had all disappeared from this world. Saint Tassol, 9 luminary sword art. And at this moment Brando also smiled. Because he found that he had found a way to use these 7 sacred swords. Lord Wind Empress, thank you. P.S. Ambush may need to be written until 13 and continue to ask for monthly votes. Chapter 1235. Brando didn't use his sword again. After blocking Bobin's sword with flaming edge, he used Frost Chancina's phantom to quickly counter with Cruz's short sword technique. He was very familiar with the swordsmanship passed down by Cruz and Erwin. Although these swordsmanship couldn't be said to be amazing, after the precipitation of history, they became more concise and clear. They were truly practical swordsmanship. With his understanding of swordsmanship and the 9 luminary sword technique as a footnote, it was enough to turn something rotten into something magical. After 7 consecutive strikes, Bobin had no choice but to give up on using flash strike sword technique because there was still flaming edge eyeing him. At this time, Bobin's heart sank as he understood that he had lost his last chance. Clang 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 clang. After 7 consecutive strikes, the 2 swords would cross 7 or 8 steps in the direction that Bobin had retreated. By the 7th strike, there was a complete difference between offense and defense. At this time, Phoenix Fire could no longer see the exquisiteness of the swordsmanship. She only felt that Mr. Brando's swordsmanship was just right. Because it was indeed just right. Bobin's heart was filled with joy. Looking at Brando's sword, his eyes shone with a strange light. Of course, he could recognize that this was the fast sword technique of the Anzaruta region. It was one of the swordsmanship that the locals used in duels. Only people who were familiar with these two countries, and only people who truly understood swordsmanship, could display this plain and simple swordsmanship to such a level. It wasn't as grand as flash strike sword technique or 9 luminary sword technique, but it was just right to be used here. There was no need to use anything more magnificent. Swordsmanship was the art of battle. A real battle didn't have any extra burdens. He had retreated to the limit, and the Phantom's fast sword technique had also reached the limit. This was the limit of human strength, but there were still some things in this world that couldn't be guessed by human strength, and that was the 9 luminary sword technique. A miracle witnessed by the moon of magic. A swordsmanship that used magic as its basis. When Bobin finished the last step of the fast sword technique, he saw a bright golden line flash in the darkness. It was a long and narrow sword blade. It was so bright that it seemed to be brighter than his entire life. His mind was intoxicated as if he had seen all the truths of the world. If it wasn't for the resolute will of an old soldier that made him wake up at the last moment and shout out that name, he would have died. This sword not only drew a trail of blood on his shoulder, but also pierced through his neck. Because it was flash strike sword art. It fanatically pursued offensive swordsmanship. Its blade was like a raging inferno, shouting to break free from all the shackles of this world, to pursue blood and victory. After a long while, Brando opened his eyes again. The eyeballs wrapped under his eyelids trembled slightly, as if he had just recovered from the dream of the previous battle. His eyes met Huang Hua's. The little girl bowed to him respectfully, not because of the complicated etiquette of the 9 Phoenix imperial family, but because of the respect of a senior. He looked at Huang Hua's dark hair and realized that not everyone in this world was lucky enough to witness an extreme sword. Huang Hua could be considered lucky as this battle would bring her many things. However, her luck did not lie in the fact that she had witnessed 2 Lemeters fight without holding back. Instead, it lay in the fact that she had enough talent to understand all of this, even though it might take some time. However, to the knight, the guards, and Lord Rosaline who had also witnessed this battle was indeed exciting, but other than that, it was meaningless. This was undoubtedly a pity. These people might never understand what they had missed out on in their entire lives. He was also lucky. When he saw Huang Hua's eyes just now and recalled the battle, he realized that there was something more in his heart. Some things on the path of swordsmanship seemed to have suddenly faded to him. The desire for victory and defeat was no longer something that he had originally calculated in his heart. It had become a pure pursuit and desire. Brando suddenly realized that his fighting talent had begun to evolve from acquired to innate, into something more pure and intuitive. That kind of thing was not to calculate the gains and losses of each strike, but to know that he wanted to win and how to win. It could not be quantified, nor could it be described with words, but it was an understanding in his heart. If he were to rehearse the previous battle again at this moment, when Bobin used the mirror of still water to suppress him, his first choice might be to strike directly with his sword, instead of cautiously putting away his lines of law first. The former was intuition, the latter was experience. He relied on his own experience, which was the most valuable asset to him, whether it was his understanding of swordsmanship, his understanding of combat, his understanding of the past history, and his understanding of everything in the Amber Sword game. They had been his greatest reliance and also his pride in the world. He was once afraid that if he lost all of this or if all of this no longer worked, what would he do? Now he had the answer. When Brando opened his eyes, it was as if he saw a smooth path in front of him. The inspiration he gained from the battle with Bobin was almost second only to the gains he gained from the battle with his grandfather in the dream. The former gave him the answer to Brando's life, and the latter gave Brando the answer to his future. Only victory, but he was not too surprised in his heart. He was even pleasantly surprised, because he knew that his battle with the deputy marshal was not the result of all of this. It should be said that it was just a trigger. Ever since he had left the elemental barrier, or rather, ever since he had battled the Silver Queen and the many Lemeters of the Empire, the constant battles and the constant increase in his knowledge had finally allowed him to surpass his past self. Perhaps his strength was still not enough. But he understood that it was just an illusion formed by the power of the slate. One day when he had a perfect body again he would get more than that power. When he understood this point, he suddenly felt the holy sword Odorfice in his hand tremble slightly, as if it was responding to the feelings in his heart. Then, under his astonished gaze, he felt golden lines that spread like flames appear in his mind, and then lines of words appeared on them. Brando suddenly understood. That was the flash strike sword technique. The complete inheritance of the Flame King Gretel. It was displayed in front of his eyes. Insursta and Tarkus stood silently on the messy street. After the Lord of Rosaline was unconscious, the noisy scene did not affect these two spirits at all. After witnessing the battle between Boban and Brando, the knight would not continue to attack the latter even if they used their knees instead of their brains to think. Thus, even though the street was noisy, the chaos mainly revolved around the Lord of Rosaline. Brando was followed by the captain of the guards, and under the watchful eyes of the two, the others behaved in an orderly manner. The guy who had cursed out loud earlier had already run off to some unknown place. It seemed that he wanted to shed the skin of a knight and would never dare to return to this place again. Insursta felt that the Earl of Tonagel might not be so petty as to argue with such a guy, but he also understood his thoughts. After all, there were not many people in this world who dared to gamble with their lives. But among these people who could be called desperados, he felt that he should be considered one of the best. Not only did he dare to joke about his existence. To the spirits, life was meaningless, only existence had value. He even dared to joke about the head of the supreme ruler of the empire. If he failed, he would not be the only one to lose his head. His close friend Tarkus' family would be uprooted, and even the kingdom in the darkness that he thought highly of might not be able to recover from this setback. But there were always lunatics in this world. He was one, Tarkus was one, and he believed that Her Majesty was the same. He could see the insanity in the depths of her beautiful eyes. She did not come to this world with the Mercury staff to save Madara, but to satisfy the uncontrollable desire to rule over everything in her heart. He believed that the Mercury staff's favor towards him originated from the same madness. Because we are dull and monotonous existences and we know it very well. Although we try our best to avoid seeing it clearly, sometimes we have to admit that time and life have lost their meaning to us. Apart from a few fellows in Woolman who treat the hundreds of years of boring experiments as fun, most of us are crazy and prone to self-destruction. Lucien said. He was a little surprised by Lucien's words. Lucien nodded. It's just that this kind of destruction is rather special, obscure and difficult to be discovered by others. We wage war not to fight for survival resources, but simply to prove the existence of the empire. Because existence is too heavy for us, Insursta muttered to himself, repeating the words spoken by the great Lich Ocaso a few hundred years ago. He turned to look at his partner and asked, "What's the matter?" "I'm thinking when the two of us made this plan, did we also have such subconscious thoughts in our hearts?" Tarkus shook his head. He was a serious person and life was as strict and regular as a wind-up clock to him. There was no meaningful or meaningless dispute. According to the age of humans, you are only 25 years old, and I am 250 years old this year. I am in the new generation of vampires. For us, this kind of feeling is inevitably a little sad and most of it is not from our own feelings. Chapter 1236. Insursta's mouth was wide open. He was almost stunned. My God, you actually spouted so much nonsense just to refute me? Should I feel honored or at a loss for what to do? It seems like this is the first time since I've met you. And my old friend, your words sound a little like the 9 phoenixes. I didn't know you had the gift of a linguist. Tarkus glanced at him. I always have, you just didn't notice. Before my 100th birthday, I always thought I would become a scholar. The poor Black Lord rolled his eyes. Then what do you say we do? He pointed at Brando and then at Boban who was next to him. That's Brando. You know who he is, the mighty lord of the Antiburo Principality. My God, if we bring these two back to the realm of eternal death, we'll be waiting for His Majesty to chop off our heads. Tarkus, however, looked in that direction and remained silent. Take one step at a time, he replied. That doesn't sound like something you would say, Tarkus. It doesn't sound like it, Tarkus replied, because it is. For the first time, Insursta discovered that his friend actually had a talent for humor, although he probably didn't think so himself. Now he was beginning to admit that Tarkus did indeed have the potential to become a scholar, because they were both neurotic, in his opinion. But that was of no use. 5th column, 7th line, 8th line. Delphian struggled to prop herself up on the ladder. Her face was as white as a thin sheet of paper, and sweat poured down like rain, densely covering her almost transparent skin. But she was careful not to let a single drop of sweat stain the bookshelf. That would be a fatal mistake and absolutely could not be allowed. Her gaze rested on one of the books. The bookshelf had traces of frequent looting, and the gilded title on the thick book spine was very ordinary. It was the genealogy of the Rosalinds. At a glance, such a book seemed to have the value of being frequently looted. Some nobles liked to reminisce about their family's history. The more glorious the family's past, the more bleak the present, the more they liked it. The Rosalinds seemed to fit this pattern, but Delphine's intuition told her that she had guessed correctly. She took a light breath and retracted her hand. She wiped the fine layer of sweat on her pure white wrist and palm with her skirt. This extremely rude action was something that she would never do on a normal day. That was something that only servants would do. But people were not born vulgar. Of course, it was the same for nobility. The Prime Minister's daughter wanted to prove this right now. After carefully wiping off her sweat, she moved the ladder closer and reached for the book in the corner of the bookshelf. Carefully, she tried to take out the book the way its original owner had taken it out. Fifth column, 8th line, History of the Rosaline Family, page 332, third paragraph. Between the 7th and 18th sentences, you found it very accurately. An abrupt voice suddenly rang out behind Delphine. It was a somewhat gentle voice, like a gentleman's careful voice, afraid of scaring her. But Delphine, who was highly strung up, was so frightened that she trembled. The thick book in her hand fell out of her hand and landed heavily on the thick carpet. She missed a step and fell backward. She screamed and fell from the air. She could not help but close her eyes. She remembered that there was a small table behind her. If she fell on it, she would most likely die. Countless complicated thoughts rushed out of her mind. She did not expect to fall short of success in the end. Perhaps it was just like what his grandfather had said about him. He was still too simple-minded and paranoid about this world. Martha had taught him this answer one by one, but in the end he still ignored all of it. What she thought of was not hatred, nor was it the empire burning in flames and the dying Silver Queen. In the chaotic illusion before her eyes, she saw the bright afternoon sun. She saw her grandfather's carriage slowly driving along the rose path into the green courtyard. Under the huge willow tree of the Nidevan family, the old man's figure became more and more crooked. The era of the giants had finally come to an end. After the supreme of the empire had obtained everything he needed, his daughter began to strip away the glory of this ancient family. She wanted revenge. For her grandfather, for her father, she wanted to take back the glory of the Nidevan family. She suddenly remembered the question Elman had asked her on a warm summer night when she and Elman were hugging by the side of the Lovers' River in the imperial capital. Delphine, tell me. Do you care about my identity and the family behind me, or do you care about me? She remembered laughing at the time because that question was laughable. She remembered looking at that silly fellow with a teasing gaze. Elman, how can you be so naive? Are there any other things besides politics in the imperial capital's noble circle? I love you and I care about your family and your identity. If you were just a lowly person, I wouldn't be with you. Elman did not say anything at that time, as if he had silently agreed. Delphine suddenly felt a little disappointed. She suddenly realized that her love and hate were mixed with something that should not have been there. But when she came back to her senses, she found that she was not in Elman's warm embrace, but in the embrace of a stranger. The man looked at her with a smile. His hands wrapped around her ankles and shoulders and held her from behind. Before she could react, he placed her on the ground politely. She was barefoot and she could feel the thick handmade carpet tickling her soles. It's too abrupt, but I can't help but like to show off. Bad habits are hard to change. The man looked at her. His black eyes were like two bright black gems. His long hair was draped over his shoulders. His appearance was somewhat feminine, but it definitely wouldn't make people think that he was feminine. He smiled at Delphine and said, "If I scared Miss Delphine, please forgive me." Fang Qi. Delphine leaned against the bookshelf, her face pale. She trembled slightly as she asked, "When did you come in?" She immediately realized that she had asked a stupid question. Her face darkened as she changed the topic. "Were you the one behind the voice at that time as well?" It only took a moment for her to realize what was going on. The voice she heard in her dreams when she was unconscious was this man's voice. It was completely different from his usual voice when he talked to Lord Rosaline, but now it was obvious. She was not stupid. She knew that she had been tricked. Lord Rosaline is too wary of us. I just needed someone who was less wary of him to explore his secrets. But the price of buying someone is too high. The people around him are either too mediocre, or too difficult to make a move on. Fang Qi did not hide from Delphine's accusation. He crossed his arms and shrugged. "Only Miss Delphine has an interesting experience." I believe I didn't force you to do anything." Delphine's expression changed. She said angrily, "You peeped into my memories? I know it's not a good habit, but I just can't help it. I'm sorry, I hope you can forgive me." Fang Qi scratched his head awkwardly, "But you're a clean girl and I didn't see anything unnecessary. You have to believe me. And the details of your life don't exist on the surface of your consciousness. You should understand what I mean." Delphine's face was ashen. She gritted her teeth and glared at him. Just as she was about to explode, the man seemed to realize that he had gone too far. He quickly shut his mouth and changed his words. I'm sorry, but I have to explain myself. After all, this is related to my reputation." "Shut up." The Prime Minister's daughter squeezed out the two words from between her teeth. Okay, Miss Delphine. Please calm down. I'll listen to your orders." The man immediately raised his hands and said, "But I believe we still have a common topic. Since you've seen those things, I can roughly guess what you want to do. Your current actions also prove my thoughts. Our goals are the same." Delphine was silent for a moment. She wanted to explode, but she suppressed her impulse and asked coldly, "What do you want to do?" Fang Qi walked past her and bent down to pick up the book from the ground. He flipped through the pages and then closed the book. He looked up and said to her, "Miss Delphine, your help to us ends here. But you've given me a surprise. Perhaps you can solve the mystery of the jadeite." "You want me to solve the mystery of the jadeite? Why should I?" Delphine looked at him coldly. "I don't care if I die." "I also don't want a great beauty like you to die, Miss Delphine," Fang Qi replied. "It's not that serious. This is just a transaction. You want to save the world and so do I. After all, neither of us wants to die. You should know that the jadeite heart only has one use. It can also let you ascend to the throne, not just the 9 phoenix." Delphine mercilessly exposed him. "That's just a side effect," Fang Qi replied nonchalantly. "Maybe it's a little important to me, but it doesn't mean anything to you, Miss Delphine. But we have a common enemy and I can help you deal with him." "I don't need, really?" Delphine's mouth moved, but she suddenly thought of something. She looked up at him and said, "You plan to cause trouble for that person?" There was a hint of a sneer in her tone. "Actually, it's not a plan." Fang Qi took out a pocket watch from his sleeve and opened it to take a look. "If my subordinates were punctual, they would have already caused trouble for him." "Then you're in big trouble?" Delphine looked at this guy a little pitifully and sneered, "You'd better pray for yourself." Chapter 1237. After much effort, Lord Rosaline slowly regained consciousness. The first thing he did when he woke up was to get the knight to support him as he walked towards Brando with a complicated expression. His fat body trembled as he prostrated himself respectfully, intending to kiss Brando's boots to ask for forgiveness. He could not care less about the Rosaline family's dignity and his dignity at this moment. Of course, the Lord thought that this was nothing in front of the young man in front of him. He was not the most outstanding of the Rosaline family masters, but at least he was not stupid. Even though he had been frightened previously, he understood everything at this moment. Regardless of whether it was his guard captain or the young man in front of him, according to the saying of the 9 Phoenix region, they were legendary existences above the clouds. To these people, as long as the Rosaline family did not want to be removed from the Swift Plains, they could not afford to offend them. He was full of regret. He had agreed to work with the Ghost Chariot, thinking that they would protect him. He had thought so too. In a place like the Swift Plains, where the Emperor was far away, even the 9 Phoenix royal family could not do anything to him. After all, the extreme sword masters of the Jade Phoenix bloodline would not easily leave the country. Those people still had to guard against the Ghost Chariot sword masters from ambushing them outside the country's borders. Gaining the favor of the Ghost Chariot on this piece of land was a great thing for the Rosaline family. However, he did not expect that without foresight, there would be immediate trouble. The 9 Phoenix royal family had not made any moves, but he had kicked an iron plate in his own territory. Looking at the two people in front of him, the Lord of Rosaline had mixed feelings. Although one of them was his guard captain, or rather the former guard captain, his mind was not muddled. His heart was as clear as a mirror, and he knew that a person like Bobin would definitely not be willing to stay in a small place like Rosaline. Before his identity was exposed, he might have been able to conceal his identity and act as the guard captain of his family, but after he revealed his true strength, a place like Rosaline would no longer be able to keep him. Even if he really did stay here, it would be meaningless. Instead, he would bring unnecessary trouble to his family. Not to mention his family that had long since lost its glory, even the famous families on the Swift Plains might not be able to provide him with a stage to perform. That was not a game that the Rosalines could participate in. His mind was clear and he did not harbor such delusions. Although he had been suspicious of why the other party would hide in the Rosaline family, perhaps for the secret of his family, or for some other reason, it was no longer important at this moment. The most important thing was that as a smart person he had to understand his current situation at all times. This was what the previous head of Rosaline's family, who was also his father, had taught him. Even though he was already over 50 years old, he still remembered this lesson with trepidation. He remembered that his father was the most outstanding patriarch of the Rosaline family in the past few generations. He was far from his father's level, but at least his father had one good point, which was that he knew his place. At this moment he could no longer care about Ghost Chariot's favor. If he did not do so, there would be no future for him. This Rosaline leader did not understand Brando, and neither did Blanche. He watched as the leader that he had brought up trembled as he knelt down and lowered his head to kiss the dust on Brando's boots. His expression did not change. He was not a cold-blooded person, but he was once the ruler of a country, and he no longer had such naive thoughts. He understood that if the other party wanted to survive in a chaotic place like Swift Plains, this was the attitude that the weaker party had to take. This had nothing to do with dignity because when one lacked the necessary strength, it was actually superfluous and might even be harmful. Just like what the Rosaline leader had thought, since he had already revealed the power of an ultimate Grand Sword Master, he could no longer stay in this place. He had to leave eventually and could no longer protect this broken family left behind by the previous leader. After he left, the other party would have to rely on his own power to survive in Swift Plains. The Nine Phoenix might not be a world where the strong were respected, but in Swift Plains this kind of thinking was very popular. Blanche had been immersed in this culture for decades, so he was more or less influenced by this kind of thinking. However, Brando did not necessarily agree, especially when he saw this fat fellow like a ball crawling down in front of him and kissing his boots. Whether it was mentally or physically, he could not take it. With a lift of his hand, 3 silver lines appeared out of thin air and held the leader up. "No need, I am not that petty." Brando looked at the other party and replied. The leader of Rosaline raised his head to look at him in shock, and at the same time, he looked at Blanche who was beside him. Blanche nodded at him and replied, "Just listen to Mr. Brando. He is the descendant of an old friend of mine, so he will not make things difficult for you." The leader of Rosaline's expression changed before he finally heaved a sigh of relief. He looked at Brando, then at his guard captain, and his heart was filled with regret. When he thought about how he had led a group of ants to provoke the other party, he could not help but feel his molars ache. At the same time he cursed his bad luck in his heart. However, who would have thought that a young man who looked like he was in his early 20s would have such power? The so-called 1-in-1,000-years genius of the Ghost Chariot lineage, Fang Qi, had been praised by the Ghost Chariot as if he was the best in the world. Before he had seen a higher level of power, he had indeed been fooled for a period of time, and was amazed by the young man's power. However, he could not help but curse in his heart, what 1-in-1,000-years genius. He has really lived his life like a dog. He had already pushed the responsibility of his misjudgment of Brando's power to the most outstanding genius of the Ghost Chariot lineage in the past 1,000 years. Unfortunately, what he didn't know was that Phantom Chariot's talent aside, Brando's strength was obtained through cheating, and there probably wouldn't be a second person in the world who could match him. However, he was not the only one who had such thoughts. He was also amazed by Brando's power. However, he was not amazed by Brando's absolute power. He was not as ignorant as the former. He knew that there were some ancient inheritances in Wone that could rapidly increase a person's power. These inheritances were hard to come by for ordinary people, but they were not as rare as one would imagine for a descendant of a marshal of the Empire's allied forces. At least he knew that Sir Darius and Her Majesty should have obtained some inheritances related to the Dark Dragon during the last battle. However, what really amazed him was the state of Brando's swordsmanship. This was something that could only be achieved through the accumulation of time and extraordinary talent. During their battle, he could easily feel that this descendant of the marshal had reached the final step in his swordsmanship. He was only one step away from the highest state of a warrior. There were such sword masters in Wone and even in Cruz. At least as far as he knew, there were a few within the Empire. However, there was no one like Brando who was only 20 years old or even 50 years old. Regarding a freak like Brando, Brando could only sigh in his heart. No wonder he had the monstrous bloodline of the Darius family. He was exactly the same as his grandfather. Brando glanced at Lord Rosaline, who was standing there respectfully. He knew that he had convinced Lord Rosaline. Of course, he also knew that Deputy Marshal Brando had contributed to this. Even though he wasn't sure what Lord Rosaline's attitude was, at least for now, he should be considered friendly. He turned back to look at Huang Hua. The little girl was also staring at him with a hint of anticipation in her dark eyes. Brando knew what the princess of the Nine Phoenix royal family wanted him to ask, so he nodded. He turned back again and said to Lord Rosaline, "Even though I know that there is only a misunderstanding between us, Lord Rosaline, I also know that this misunderstanding didn't happen by chance, right?" Lord Rosaline's heart skipped a beat. He knew that Brendel wasn't stupid. Even though he had expected this question, he still couldn't help but be stuck at this moment. He knew that no matter how he answered, he would definitely offend either party. He hoped that Brando wouldn't ask this question, but he also knew that just like how he knew about Brendel's existence, this young man definitely knew about their existence too. To be honest, he was more unwilling to offend Ghost Chariot because the Rosaline family had to establish themselves in the Swift Plains. Even if this young man agreed to protect him, he couldn't possibly stay here all the time. However, Ghost Chariot's lineage had been rooted here for many years, and its sphere of influence had long been deeply rooted. Anyone who wanted to make a living on this land would never choose to offend Ghost Chariot. More realistically, if he dared to say no, he felt that the Rosaline family would disappear even further. That young man seemed to be easy to talk to, but who knew if his sword was just as easy to talk to? He might still have the compassion and benevolence of a young man, but that didn't mean that he was a fool. He said dryly, then he saw something in the eyes of his former guard captain and stammered, "Yes. Yes. In other words, you and your knight are looking for trouble with me not because I caused trouble in Urin this afternoon, but because of another reason, right?" This. Chapter 1238. Brando could have asked Blanche, but he didn't choose to do so. Although he didn't know why the vice-marshal was here, he could tell from his attitude towards the Lord that he had some feelings for this place. He felt that if he were to ask, the other party might give him the real answer. However, that would seem like a betrayal to the Rosaline family. Perhaps the other party would not be calculative on account of his grandfather, but Linley did not want to owe the other party a favor. Besides, he didn't think that he wouldn't be able to convince the Lord, who didn't seem like a tough nut to crack. "I heard what you said just now, Lord," Brendel reminded him. What did I say?" "You intend to let your knight attack Phoenix Hua. As a lord, you won't be calculative with a little girl over such a small matter, right?" "This? All right, Lord, I want to hear the truth. You don't have to worry about anyone finding trouble for you. With me here, no one will dare to attack you." "Indeed it's here." The Rosaline Lord couldn't help but laugh bitterly. If possible, he was willing to believe that this young man had the ability, but he obviously couldn't stay in the Swift Plains forever. He could protect himself for a while, but could he protect the Rosaline family forever? But he knew that he had to make a choice. It depended on whether the Rosaline family would be finished now or after this incident. The latter might still have a chance to turn things around, but it would inevitably be like drinking poison to quench one's thirst. Brando obviously understood the hesitation in the Rosaline Lord's heart. Just as he was about to add more to shake the Lord's resolve, Phoenix Hua suddenly spoke. "My lord, the Ghost Chariot isn't your only choice. In the history of the Nine Phoenix, they are just a bunch of losers. The Nine Phoenix welcomes all law-abiding people, and the Rosaline family doesn't have to stay in the Swift Plains." The little girl, who had always been taciturn and courteous, spoke to the Lord of Rosaline and everyone present with a serious expression. "My lord, your family has left Swift Plains for decades. Why don't you choose a brighter path instead of staying here with the anomalies? Be it for the sake of your family or your people. Are you not willing to see the Rosaline family prosper in your hands?" This? Lord Rosaline was completely dumbfounded. He was still unsure of this little girl's true identity. Although Ghost Chariot's people had told him that she was a direct descendant of the Jade Phoenix bloodline of the Nine Phoenix royal family, there were many direct descendants of the Jade Phoenix bloodline, and very few people could say such a thing. Moreover, she was just a little girl. No matter how he looked at it, it was impossible for her to be the Nine Phoenix Crown Princess. If she was really the Nine Phoenix Crown Princess, he wouldn't dare to cause trouble for Huang Hua even if he had 100 guts. It was a pity that Lord Rosaline didn't expect Huang Hua's identity to be much nobler than he had imagined. In the Nine Phoenix Kingdom, the position of the Crown Princess wasn't fixed, but there were only a few Jade Phoenix mages descendants in history. The former only required qualifications, while the latter required a special bloodline. "Trust her. She can be responsible for her words," Brando said to him. However, he also looked at Huang He strangely. Of course, he could tell that the mountain of flesh in front of him was tempted. The little girl's words seemed to have scratched the itch in his heart at the right time. The Lord was already wavering, and it was only a matter of time before he changed sides. In fact, Huang He didn't promise much and she didn't make any promises. Brando didn't expect this little girl, who looked a little silly and innocent, to be able to say such rigorous and watertight words with a straight face. He walked to her side. Huang He bowed slightly to him and explained softly, "Mr. Brando, you don't have to be surprised. After all, Huang He is also a member of the Nine Phoenix royal family. I will also learn what my brothers and sisters want to learn." "No," Brando replied, "but you are only 10 years old, right?" In the Nine Phoenix, Huang He has always been a little smarter than the others. The little girl smiled and replied cheekily, "But in front of Mr. Brando, she is far inferior." Brando looked at her with some surprise. He seemed to have guessed something from her words. "You want to learn swordsmanship from me?" Huang He shook her head. "After watching the battle between you and that person, Huang He understood that it is impossible for Huang He to go too far on the path of swordsmanship." Hearing what she said, Brando's eyes flashed with a strange light. "You can see that too? I don't know if it's right or wrong, but I have this idea in my heart." Brando couldn't help but gasp. This little girl's talent was too terrifying. She could even sense such things with her intuition. It was simply incredible. He once thought that it was ridiculous enough that he had the system, but compared to this little girl, it seemed to be nothing. After all, the system could only help him in terms of absolute strength. After reaching the supreme state, the only thing left to help him was to digitize this world. However, Huang He's talent could help her continue on this path. She might be slower than him at the beginning, but after reaching a certain level, she would be well prepared. She might even break through all the way to the true perfect body. Why is there such a person in this world? Brando couldn't help but feel a throbbing in his heart. Huang He didn't belong to this era. Her era obviously wouldn't come until she fully grew up. In the Amber Sword, that should be at least after the year of the Starfire. When she started on this path, wouldn't it be after the twilight of the game? Then how many people like Huang He were there in this world? Was she still immortal? Brando frowned as he looked at Huang He. He vaguely saw something in her. If her potential represented the future of the Iron Folk, then perhaps Martha's plan was not impossible. At this moment he suddenly understood why he was thrown into this place after passing through the space-time rift, and why he suddenly met these people and a somewhat strange little girl like Huang He. Perhaps this was not a coincidence. "Actually, I'm not a swordsman, Huang He." Just when Huang He was a little uncomfortable under his gaze, Brando suddenly let out a long breath and said, "I'm a warrior." "Mr. Brando is not a swordsman?" Huang He asked with some surprise. "But Mr. Brando's sword is obviously the ultimate sword." "It's not that a warrior can't use a sword, but it's not only the sword saint who uses a sword," Brando replied. "Swordsmen always rely on their swords, but as a warrior, you can only rely on your own heart that has experienced hundreds of battles. That is a path that is carved out from the slaughter of beasts. Without experiencing hundreds of deaths, you will never understand it." "Teacher, Huang He is willing to learn the way of the warrior." Huang He's eyes lit up slightly. "Nirvana after 100 deaths, isn't this the way of the Jade Phoenix?" She had a faint premonition in her heart, as if this was the path that belonged to her. Brando did not answer her directly. He just smiled and patted her on the head. "I can't always stay in Nine Phoenix. Huang He, as the successor of the Jade Phoenix, you can't go to Erewhon with me. On the way to Green Jade Hill, let's see how much you can learn." Huang He shook her head and respectfully bowed to him as a disciple. She said, "Once a teacher, always a father. I don't dare to go against this principle." Everyone liked obedient students, and Brando was naturally the same. He was very satisfied with Huang He's attitude. At this moment he could not help but think of Haruz, who was far away in Erewhon. Both of his students could be said to be excellent, but it was a pity that he was not a wizard. He and the little prince were teacher and student in name, but they were not teachers and students. In fact, when he returned to Erewhon, he planned to let Senior teach the little prince. In terms of familiarity with black magic, Senior was one of the best in the whole of Erewhon, even though she was only an elementalist in her previous life. While Brando and Huang He were talking, Lord Rosaline, who was standing in the middle of the street, made up his mind. Just like what Brando had seen, he was indeed moved at the first moment. Even though he was not excellent enough, he was like the ancestors of the Rosaline family. There was not a moment when he did not want to restore the glory of his family. Why did he want to cooperate with the Ghost Chariot? He had no choice but to go to Swift Plains to seek refuge. Otherwise he could have just handed over the mystery of the jade to the ghost chariot, but he did not. In fact, in the depths of his heart, he might have wanted to restore the glory of the Rosaline family to its most glorious era. Even though he did not have the ability, he coincidentally knew a secret that the previous masters of the family had never discovered. The Rosaline family only lacked an opportunity, and now this opportunity had appeared in front of him. What was Swift Plains? What was the ghost chariot? Although the overlords of the Swift Plains claimed that they didn't care about the Nine Phoenix, everyone knew that it was because they knew that the Nine Phoenix wouldn't come to such a desolate place. If there was an opportunity, who would not want to develop in the Nine Phoenix? It was the same for the Rosaline family. The only thing that he was hesitant about was whether the little girl's words were trustworthy, but he got the answer from Brando's eyes. In the end, this guard captain did not abandon the Rosaline family. He could not help but feel touched. Perhaps Brando was really staying here because of his father's kindness, but it was not the first time that he had doubts about him. It was a pity that this kind of repayment ended here. He could not help but feel that it was a pity. Thinking of this, the Lord lifted his head and said to Brando, who was not far away, "My lord, it's the ghost chariot. It's the people from the ghost chariot who are manipulating everything behind the scenes. Their target is Miss Huanghua." Brando smiled and turned his head back from his conversation with Huanghua. He had no experience with this, as he had already expected it. He looked at the Lord and said, "I'm not familiar with the ghost chariot, but I'm sure you've had dealings with them before. If I'm not wrong, they wouldn't just send you to die as cannon fodder, right?" The Rosaline Lord's face turned red, but humans were strange. He was not angry at Brando's mockery. Instead, he resented the ghost chariot. If not for these fellows not telling him anything and letting him come here to kick an iron plate, would the Rosaline family be in such a dilemma? In his opinion, those fellows were clearly treating him as cannon fodder. Thinking of this, he could not help but feel indignant. He nodded and said, "Mr. Brando is right. The people from the ghost chariot asked me to delay you. Their people seem to have gone to the dock. Now that I think about it, they knew that my people couldn't stop you, so they probably planned to ambush you there." Since he already had such a thought, the Lord did not hold back and directly told him about the ghost chariot's plan. Of course, he did not know what the ghost chariot's plan was, but they were moving around in his territory, so he knew where they went. But he had actually wronged Fang Chi and the others. No matter how smart the ghost chariot was, it was impossible for them to guess Brando's strength out of thin air. In Delphian's memory, Fang Chi had seen him fighting with the supreme masters of Cruz's people. Unfortunately, as a normal person, the daughter of the Prime Minister could not remember every detail of the battle at that time. More importantly, the memories of mortals would never leave the existence of miracles, so Delphian did not leave any memories of Archangel Iroma in her subconscious. So, in the eyes of the ghost chariot and the others, Brando was at most an expert with the strength of an eternal end. According to Won's grading system, it was the level of the elemental truth to the peak of the law. Based on his age, it might be even lower. So, they wishfully thought that Lord Rosaline and his knight, as well as the guard captain who might have some strength, should have no problem delaying Brando and the others. Even if they could not defeat them, it would be enough to delay them. Their real target was actually Mr. Liu, who was heading to the port area. This guard of the Nine Phoenix royal family naturally made them extremely wary. After hearing the Lord of Rosaline's description, Brendel instantly understood the other party's thoughts. He did not know how strong the ghost chariot was in Rosaline, but since the guy named Fang Chi was also here, it should not be too bad. He immediately frowned, feeling that Mr. Liu's current situation might not be too good. However, the people from the ghost chariot should have set off for some time. Even if Mr. Liu was in trouble, it would have been a while. Even if he and Huang Ho rushed over, it would be useless. Maybe the other party would even ambush them there. "My lord, do you have a topographic map of the port area in your castle?" Brendel's eyes brightened when he thought about the ambush. "My lord, do you have a map of the port area in your castle?" The latter immediately understood what he meant and quickly said, "Of course there is. In fact, there is a secret passage in the city that leads to the port area without being noticed by everyone." At this point he added a little embarrassedly, "That was the escape route left behind by our ancestors when they built the castle." "Very good. Now it's our turn to ambush them." Brando replied with satisfaction. Although he had taken Huang Hua as his student, he could not always play hide-and-seek with the people from the ghost chariot. If he could get rid of these guys once and for all, he did not mind helping Huang Hua and Mr. Liu. Moreover, adding some trouble to Madara's plan in the east was also beneficial to his physical and mental health. Chapter 1239. After completely siding with the Nine Phoenix royal family, Rosaline no longer held back. He immediately ordered his subordinates to return to the castle to retrieve the distribution map of Rosaline's establishment. To be on the safe side, he also ordered Kasaf, the captain of the night team that Brando had met earlier at the Quzong's river. He was one of the last knights to arrive. At that moment, he was overjoyed that he had avoided a disaster. He was no longer as arrogant as before towards Brando and Phoenix Fire. He was careful and respectful to lead his subordinates to follow them and guard against Ghost Chariot's interference. However, he also understood that the probability of Ghost Chariot going to such great lengths to intercept such a distribution map was close to zero. He was only doing this to show that he was willing to cooperate with them. Brando was quite satisfied with his attitude. This Rosaline lord did not seem to be very capable, but at least he was sensible enough. That was enough. In times like these he always preferred sensible people. Kasaf and his subordinates quickly left, leaving only the others to accompany Brando and Insursta in the cold wind. After September, even the sea breeze at Rosaline Harbor was somewhat dry. The biting cold wind from the sea made one's face hurt, but without Brando's approval, most of the people present did not dare to express their dissatisfaction. As the lord of Rosaline, the plump city lord naturally lived like a prince. Even if the weather was a little bad, he would not be willing to go out, let alone this unpleasant autumn wind. But at this moment, his expression seemed to be one of joy. To be able to chat with Brendel, or rather, to be able to answer Brendel's questions, was enough to make him feel extremely honored. Speaking of which, not to mention Rosaline, even in the swift plains, how many people could converse with the celestial beings above the clouds at any time? Because of Lord Rosaline's attitude, Brando quickly understood the situation here. With Deputy Marshal Brando's occasional confirmation, he roughly grasped the cooperation between Ghost Chariot and the people here. Just as he had expected, the Ghost Chariot was the most powerful force in the swift plains, but their cooperation with Lord Rosaline was not as straightforward as he had imagined. Normally, as the more powerful party, the Ghost Chariot would rarely exchange any meaningful opinions with Rosaline. Most of the time it was a one-sided order. This was because the Rosaline family needed their protection. Since they needed help and were far weaker than the other party, there was no need to talk about cooperation. This was a very normal thing. Since this was the case, the cooperation between both parties was not as sincere as imagined. Otherwise, Lord Rosaline would not have been immediately moved by Phoenix Fire's suggestion. Brando also noticed that Lord Rosaline was always evasive when it came to this, so he could not help but suspect that there was more to the cooperation between both parties. However, this had nothing to do with him, so he let Lord Rosaline be. He did not pursue the matter, nor did he confirm it with Marshal Brando. His magnanimity surprised Lord Rosaline, and he became even more determined to stand on the side of the Nine Phoenix royal family. Other than that, the locals did not know much about their cooperation. The only thing Brando knew about Ghost Chariot was that Fang Chi, whom Phoenix Fire and Mr. Liu called the 1-in-1,000 years genius of the Ghost Chariot clan, might be staying near Rosaline at this moment. However, Lord Rosaline did not dare to confirm this piece of information. However, Huanghua had told him that Fang Chi was one of the core members of the Ghost Chariot, so he might have two elders accompanying him at all times. Luin asked about the strength of these Ghost Chariot elders and learned that they were about the same level as Mr. Bobin, which meant that they were half a Lemeter. Of course, their battle experience was far inferior to the veterans of the November War. Brando was known as the White Wolf of the Far region. 60 years ago, his swordsmanship had reached perfection, and he was the strongest existence among the 12 deputy marshals. Even if the other party still had strength on the surface, according to Brendel's attitude of being lenient to the enemy, he should have no problem dealing with the Ghost Chariot with the help of the Great Elder, or even a genuine supreme-class expert. Almost a quarter of an hour had passed during the conversation, but the knights still needed some time to reach the castle. During Brando's conversation with Lord Rosaline, he noticed more than once that the young man named Seabass, the adopted son of Na-Xin, wanted to come to his side a few times. However, he seemed to be hesitant and did not dare to come over in the end. However, his actions attracted Brando's attention. He thought of something and took out the diary. Previously, because his attention was diverted by Lord Rosaline's knights, he put the diary in his pocket and did not have time to read it. Now that he had recalled this matter, he was a little curious. He thought to himself that he was not familiar with this place, so who would pass the message to him? Now, it seemed that it was impossible for Mr. Liu to do so. Could it be this fellow's secret enemy? Brando could not help but look at Lord Rosaline in front of him. Although the latter saw Brando take out the diary, he did not notice it. In fact, he did not know that it was a diary. He flipped open the diary and thought that if this was a message from the Lord's secret enemy, then he would just pretend that he didn't see it. In any case, this person was now considered an ally, and his attitude was quite good. Regardless of whether it was for Marshal Blanche or Phoenix Fire, he had no reason to go back on his words. Brando first apologized to this potential friend in his heart, then he flipped to page 177 according to Seabass instructions. Counting the pages might take some time for an ordinary person, but for a person with high perceptive perception like him, it only took a moment. When he saw the words written in crooked handwriting on the page, his gaze suddenly froze. At first glance, he could tell that the words were written by a non-dominant hand. Although the person tried to cover it up, he could still tell that it was written by a woman. The other party had made a lot of details in the words. To an ordinary person it was almost flawless, but he was not an ordinary person. Tolman was a scholar who specialized in ancient languages. When Brando first met him, he naturally asked for the knowledge and experience of similar scholars. Tolman's attainment in the language could be said to be better than Erwin and many of the half-baked staff who worked in the reference room in the Royal Library. The text message on the page read, "The real purpose of the ghost chariot in Rosaline was to covet the stone notebook found by the 17th generation of the Rosaline family, because this notebook recorded a long-rumored secret, the mystery of the emerald. The people of Nine Phoenix believe that the mystery of the Emerald Dragon contains information about the whereabouts of the heart of the Emerald Dragon, which is also known as the Heart of the Emerald. After my investigation, I found that it is actually the Pearl of Nature. Mr. Brando, if you are still concerned about this news, please come to Rosaline Castle to find me." Brando tore the page with a snap, then crumpled it into a ball and put it in his pouch. Whether it was the mystery of the emerald or the heart of the Emerald Dragon, he did not care about them. There were so many treasures in this world and he could not have them all. Moreover, after seeing the treasures of the Termosian people outside the elemental barrier, it could be said that his vision had improved a lot, and his interest in these treasures of the lower realm had faded a lot. However, the last few words on the note deeply touched him. The 7 divine swords. The Pearl of Nature. Naturally, that was something he was determined to get. But now he was more concerned about whether this thing was real or not. Who was the person who sent him this diary? How did they know that he needed this thing now? And it seemed like the other party knew him, otherwise he would not have been able to call out his name. He had just entered the city today, and even if the other party was the archenemy of Lord Rosaline, it was impossible for them to investigate him so thoroughly. He raised his head and looked at Seabass, who was not far away. The latter's hair stood on end under his gaze, and it felt like he was being stared at by a hunting beast. Brando raised the diary, which had a feminine aura, and waved it in front of the other party. "Who asked you to deliver it?" The youth was stunned, then shook his head vigorously. "Sir, I can't say." "But didn't you say that as long as I read this diary I can tell you?" "This?" Seabass glanced at Lord Rosaline, who was not far away. He thought to himself, that was then, this is now. If I were to mention Miss Delphine's name in front of Lord Rosaline, wouldn't I be betraying her? Brando saw through his gaze, so he turned to Lord Rosaline and asked, "Do you know him?" Lord Rosaline looked at Seabass in confusion. Fortunately, he was not a truly important person. Even though there were many servants in Rosaline Castle, it was not to the extent that he did not recognize his own blacksmith's apprentice. "I think I know him." Lord Rosaline raised his head and said angrily, "Who are you and why are you here? How dare you not answer Sir's question?" He then explained to Brando with a bashful face, "Sir, he is still a child and is not very sensible. Please don't be angry, I will immediately explain to him what is going on." Brando shook his head. "There is no need for that. This is a clever lad and he is a good person." Seabass was still a little uneasy at first. After all, he did not know the consequences of going against the will of an important person. His uncle Xen Zheng, who was behind him, kept winking at him, but for Miss Delphian he was ready to go all out. P.S. As usual, the progress did not follow my expectations. Clack clack clack, the world is indeed peaceful and everything is normal. Silently vomiting blood. Chapter 1240. However, he did not expect Brando to say such a thing, and the dark-skinned youth was overjoyed. He knew that this young man's position in his lord's heart was very important, and Brando's words were a great help to him. As expected, he saw his lord giving him a look of praise, and he could not help but feel elated. At the same time he felt a little guilty. No matter what, he still could not answer Brendel's question. He did not know that Brendel actually did not need to get any information from him. From Lord Rosaline's reply, Brendel knew that this letter should be from within Rosaline Castle. Then this person's identity was somewhat interesting. The other party seemed to be a female. Brando could not help but turn around and ask, "My lord, do you have any spies in the castle? If you send someone to retrieve the blueprint, will they threaten your family?" Rosaline shook his head. "Don't worry, my lord. I'm usually alone. Even though I have 2 sons, they are not in Rosaline right now." But when he said this, he suddenly paused and revealed a somewhat hesitant expression. Brando thought to himself that he did not even have a daughter. That was strange. Other than that, what other women would have a higher status in the castle? Could it be that the butler was a woman? Other than Ondina and Flofa, he had not seen any other nobles using female butlers. Hence, Makarov and the rest looked at him strangely. In fact, Tonagel and Radner had said that he was a lecherous man. It was not that he did not know about such rumors. Brando did not notice Rosaline's expression immediately, and asked casually, "My lord, do you have any guests in the castle?" He did not expect that his casual question would cause such a huge reaction from the other party. Rosaline immediately stuttered, as though he had suddenly thought of something, but could not say it out loud. If he had not noticed the flash of hesitation in Lord Rosaline's eyes before, he could not help but notice the huge change now. He wondered if he had hit the nail on the head. He subconsciously asked, "What is it, my lord?" Rosaline opened his mouth and was about to answer, but at this moment, a group of people riding on wingless dragons rushed over in a panic, causing the stones on the ground to jump up. Brando turned around and saw that those people were Kasaf and his men that he had sent out earlier. Before they even got close, they saw Brando and his lord and shouted, "Bad news! My lord, Miss Delphian has been taken away by Ghost Chariot's men." "What?" Rosaline's expression immediately changed, as though his worries had come true. He swayed on his horse, and if it was not for Brando's quick reflexes, he would have fallen off his horse again. At the same time, Brando heard another shout from behind him. "What?" He heard it clearly. It was the voice of the young man called Seabass. Brando's heart was suddenly clear, as he had heard it clearly. "Miss Delphian has been taken away by Ghost Chariot's men." There might be many people in this world named Delphian, but he did not doubt that Miss Delphian was the daughter of the Prime Minister. Although he was not sure how she came here, or how she knew that he was looking for the nature pearl, the contents of the letter in his hand had proven everything. No wonder he felt that the writing style was familiar. Back at Fathom Port, this Prime Minister's daughter had been doing paperwork for him, and he had seen many of her reports on the front line and supplies. When he heard this name, Brando could not help but frown. Back at Fathom Port, he had forgiven this woman, and after that she seemed to have let go of her hatred. However, later on in Rushta, when the Roman's aunt went to the Cat and Beard Inn to save the waitress, she discovered something. Later on, she had privately mentioned this matter to him in the White Rose Garden. Although he was not completely sure, when the Roman was plotted against by the tree herders, this Prime Minister's daughter might have played a part in it. Brando actually believed this at that time. Later on, he had carefully thought about Delphian's motives. She had meticulously planned to help him fight against the Empire, and on the surface, it was for the Nidevan family. However, this statement was a little abrupt, and not only him, but Medisha and Amandina had also reminded him more than once. Even the little princess, who was usually aloof from worldly affairs, had a conflict with her. In fact, he knew in his heart that her intentions were not that simple, but when this woman was caught in the dragon flames, she was indeed a little pitiful. For the sake of the Silver Dragon Lady, he had agreed to let go of his hatred. But later on, he realized that Delphian had done this to create an irreconcilable hatred between him and the Silver Queen. Because the Empire could not be overturned, the hatred would continue. She just did not expect the Silver Queen's final outcome, or else her target of revenge would not only be him, but also the entire kingdom of Erewhon. After the trip to the elemental barrier, especially after the battle with Dusk, he gradually understood this matter. It could only be said that this woman's heart was really too crazy. He recalled the time at Fathom Port, the Prime Minister's daughter who often buried herself in writing records in the study room. The sunlight that penetrated through the grated window fell on her body, and she seemed so quiet and skilled. He really could not believe that such a woman's heart could be so vicious and paranoid. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but hesitate. First, he doubted whether the letter was real or fake. No matter how Delphian knew that he was looking for the nature's orb, after playing the trick of crying wolf for so many times, it was natural for people to have this kind of association, which made him suspect that the woman was lying. To be exact, he did not want to save such a woman, nor did he want to have any dealings with her. In fact, because of the Roman's experience, if she was in front of him at this moment, it was still a question whether he could control himself from killing her. On the other hand, there was only one nature's orb in this world, and it might be the only way to save this world and save the Roman. If he missed this opportunity, who knew how much time he would have to waste? If the nature's orb was really in Nine Phoenix, he did not know when he would be able to return here. Going back and forth would take almost a year. While he was still hesitating, Lord Rosaline could not help but say, "My lord, Miss Delphian is the most distinguished guest in my territory." He subconsciously looked at Brendel and Blanche with pleading eyes, but he did not dare to say the words out loud. There was no such thing as a free lunch in this world, and he could make the Rosaline family owe him a favor if it was someone else. However, to someone like Brando, a favor from the Rosaline family was not worth much. In fact, Brando did not need to turn around to feel that the young man named Seabass was also looking at him with a burning gaze. Thinking of Delphian's usual behavior, he could not help but shake his head. He thought to himself that this woman really liked to play with people's hearts. It was impossible for him to have any good feelings towards such a person. However, Huang Hua did not know that the person at the center of this topic was such a person. She could not help but show a look of disgust. The people from the ghost chariot actually kidnapped a lady. They are getting more and more despicable. However, she did not ask her teacher to help. In Nine Phoenix, a teacher was like a father. The decision of the elders was not something that the juniors could interfere with. Brando did not say anything. He made the best choice, which was to pass the crumpled letter to Huang Hua. Huang Hua was slightly stunned. She raised her head and looked at him with her clear black and white eyes, puzzled. "Take a look. This might have something to do with the royal family of Nine Phoenix," Brando answered. Huang Hua nodded seriously. She opened the crumpled letter, glanced at it, and cried out in surprise. Then she raised her head and looked at Lord Rosaline, who was not far away, with a burning gaze. "My lord, do you know about the mystery of Emerald?" Lord Rosaline's expression changed immediately. He looked at Huang Hua suspiciously, then at Brando. Huang Hua seemed a little anxious. The mystery of Emerald was related to the legitimacy of the royal family. For a long time, the Jade Phoenix bloodline and their allies had been searching for the whereabouts of the heart of the Azure Dragon in Nine Phoenix. They did not expect the Ghost Chariot clan to take the lead here. She had previously asked Brando for help in a hurry, which was actually against the etiquette of the Nine Phoenix. However, as a daughter of the royal family, she had to put down her reservations for this matter. One could imagine how important this secret was. Her fixed gaze seemed to have seen through Lord Rosaline's heart. She immediately said, "My lord, no one knows better than the Jade Phoenix bloodline what the mystery of Emerald means to the Rosaline family. The Nine Phoenix can give you what the Ghost Chariot clan cannot. You should know what I'm talking about." Lord Rosaline seemed to have understood at once. He turned to look at Mr. Bobin, who nodded at him immediately. As an important minister of the Rosaline family in the previous dynasty, the Marshal obviously knew some of the secrets of the Rosaline family. The mystery of Emerald might mean the legitimacy of the Nine Phoenix bloodline, but to the Rosaline family, it was just a bargaining chip. If they wanted to rely on this thing to ascend to the throne of the Nine Phoenix, they were really thinking too much. Lord Rosaline obviously understood this. He suppressed the ambition in his heart and quickly nodded at Brando and Huang Hua. Brando's heart sank immediately. He was almost certain that Delphian did not lie to him about this matter. The mystery of Emerald was indeed in the hands of the Rosaline family, and that thing was very likely related to the whereabouts of the Nature Pearl. Then, he had no choice but to take action. Chapter 1241. He had made up his mind. Even though Lord Rosaline had said that there was a secret passage in the castle that led to the port, Brando did not need any secret passage at all. He took the map of the port from the night and glanced at it casually. He memorized the terrain of the main entrances and exits, then returned the map. After rejecting Lord Rosaline's request for assistance, he entrusted Phoenix's fire to the former Grand Duke of Antiburo, Blanche, to take care of her. That young lady was quiet and did not express any opinion, but her expression showed that she was not satisfied. "Mr. Tarkus," he thought for a moment, then turned to the vampire and said, "Now I need you to do me a favor. Go to the Pirates' Bay now and let your ship sail out to sea. Seal off the waters near Rosaline. Since you usually pretend to be pirates, you shouldn't lack weapons on board, right?" Tarkus glanced at Insursta and knew that he had to help. He nodded. Relying on two fast sailing ships to seal off Rosaline's port was almost an impossible task. Even though the port was remote in Taiga Strait, it could handle at least dozens of ships, including fishing boats. But now, thanks to Lord Rosaline's order to seal off the port, it was not impossible to give it a try. Besides, Brando did not expect Madara's two-masted sailing ships to block the Chariot Ghost's men. It would be enough as long as they could hold them off at sea. At that moment he had already memorized the layout of the port area. He remembered the main entrances and exits, but he was still worried that the other party would have an escape route that he did not know about. After all, even Madara had left an escape route nearby. How could the Chariot Ghost, whose forces were more deeply rooted in this area, not have a backup plan? After making all the preparations, he came to Insursta's side. The latter was shocked. Of course he knew what Brando was going to do. Since he had let Tarkus leave alone, he would definitely keep him as a hostage. But that was not what he was concerned about. Don't stop. I have flying boots. Insursta's face changed drastically. He quickly raised his hand to stop Brando from approaching. That's too slow. Brando shook his head regretfully. He grabbed the guy by the collar and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Insursta. No, I don't need your apology. Put me down. Damn it, you can't embarrass a dark noble like this." Tarkus raised his head and silently watched his colleague and Brando disappear into the air. Then he turned around and bowed to Brando, Phoenix Hua, and the others before leaving without saying a word. So it's a big bat. Seeing Tarkus's movements, Blank curled his lips. What makes you say that, Mr. Bobin? Phoenix Fire retracted her gaze from the southeast. That was the direction of the port in Rosaline City. Only these fellows would be so courteous to their enemies. They have the longest history among the dark nobles. Their attitude is probably due to their sense of superiority, Blank replied. He then turned to Huang Hua and said, "Call me Blank, young lady." "How do you do, Mr. Blank?" That afternoon, many Rosaline residents heard a terrifying scream in the air, but the Insursta dragon eventually shut its mouth when it was close to the port area. It was not because he cared about the big picture, but because he knew that if he did not shut up, the bastard who carried him in circles in the air above Rosaline would shut up for him. Once was enough for him to be embarrassed. The Black Lord did not want his reputation to be known in Madara's history in such a way. Brando was indeed satisfied with this guy's understanding of the situation. He landed near the port and among the sheds outside the port. It was not that he did not have an invisibility spell. There were many similar camouflage spells among the low-circle spells of the elementalists, but he did not think that his poor magic ability could deceive the existence of the supreme class in the Ghost Chariot, so he landed in advance. Anyway, with his current ability, moving on the ground was not much more troublesome than moving in the air. He just wanted to save some trouble. He first dropped the future star of Madara in his hand. The latter screamed and expressed great dissatisfaction with his behavior of forcibly dropping a guest. However, Brando ignored him. If the Black Lord of Madara, who had elemental awakening strength, could fall to his death from a height of less than 3 meters, then the Kingdom of the Dead Moon would be doomed. Seeing that Brando ignored him, the latter got up, patted the dust off his body and complained in a low voice. Then he began to complain that his clothes were wrinkled, his hair was messed up, and the makeup on his face was ruined. This was intolerable for a dark noble. Brando was looking around the place where he landed and found that the sheds here should be where the workers on the dock lived. It was now evening, the time when the workers went home after a busy day, but there were not many adult men in the sheds. Only some women and children in ragged clothes looked at the two uninvited guests who fell from the sky with some fear. A few children who were chasing saw them and stopped with some vigilance. Immediately, women ran out from the nearby sheds and dragged them back. Insursta looked at this scene and stopped. "It doesn't look good, my lord. What do you think?" Brando looked back. He knew how smart this guy was. History had proven him to be a genius more than once. "Well." Insursta lowered his head and looked at his wrinkled shirt with some regret. "This shirt was given to me by His Majesty the Emperor. I haven't worn it for long." Brando was suddenly speechless. "I didn't know that your Supreme had such a hobby." His Majesty always sympathizes with his subjects. He probably felt that his excuse was a little unreliable and added, "My lord, you should know that the Dark Nobles have always been very concerned about their appearance." "Is that so? Why didn't I know about this?" "The Liches of Rover never seem to wear clothes, so much so that some scholars think that they are somewhat immoral." "Ahem, that's an exception, my lord. Look at Tarkus. Mr. Tarkus is a vampire nobleman. Well, actually I also yearn for the style of those old nobles." In Sursta's two black holes, the soul fire dancing in his two soulless eyes could not help but be a little resentful. Of course, Brando knew that this guy was actually indirectly expressing his dissatisfaction with his previous actions. Although his relationship with Sursta and Tarkus was a little delicate, and both sides could not be considered allies, it might be more appropriate to say that they were rivals. It was just that he had the absolute advantage and the other party did not dare to act rashly. But he also understood that he could not force these two guys into a desperate situation. The old-fashioned and stubborn Tarkus was better off, especially the guy in front of him, who knew what kind of schemes he had in his mind. He hoped that this Dark Lord would leave his thoughts to scheme against him in the realm of eternal death, and not cause trouble for him here. Thus, he glanced at the other party and replied, "Only this time. There won't be a next time." "Ah, that's great. You mean it?" "If we don't encounter such a situation next time. In the name of Martha, what's the difference between that and not saying anything? As long as you can keep up with my speed?" "I can't." "Then I won't discuss this with you. Next time I'll bring Mr. Tarkus. Deal?" Sursta decisively betrayed his colleague. Tarkus, who was far away in the Pirate's Cove, sneezed a few times, but the latter rubbed his nose and looked up expressionlessly, completely ignoring someone's scheme. He was used to it anyway. Sursta then looked around at the surrounding shanty area and replied to Brando, "It seems that the people of the Phantom Chariot have sealed off the harbor. This means that they have been prepared, Mr. Earl?" "You think so too?" Brando asked. "They obviously don't trust that Lord Rosaline as much as you think. Judging from their cooperation, that's indeed the case. Even if they didn't expect that Lord Rosaline would betray them at the last minute, they probably calculated that he and his lousy knight wouldn't be able to stop you. It's easy for you to get something out of those people. They're obviously not tough guys." Brando thought for a while and felt that there was nothing wrong with Sursta's analysis. He nodded and said, "They already expected us to come to the harbor? I can only say that it's fortunate that we didn't use that secret passage. I think that Lord Rosaline's so-called secret passage is only a secret from his knight subordinates. Poor guy." Sursta commented while shaking his head. "Then they sealed off the harbor area, and even the people inside are not allowed to come out. Are they afraid that we will know what's going on inside?" Brando asked again. "That's possible, but I think it's a little too much. They might be doing this to cover up something. There are many eyes in the harbor area, but what kind of thing must be done in an open area?" "A ritual." Brando immediately understood. "It seems that they have already prepared a trap." "I think so too. Do you have a way to deal with it?" Sursta asked. He actually wanted to say that if Brendel wasn't completely confident, then he should leave Oderfeis and Haurangaya to him for safekeeping. However, his words changed in the end. "If you're not confident, why don't we let Tarkus sail the ship outside the harbor and launch an attack from the outer harbor?" "That won't be necessary." Brando shook his head in disdain. "Leave this little trick to me." "Huh?" Chapter 1242. Sursta suddenly felt a shudder pass through his body. The feeling scared him so much that he almost jumped up from the ground. He saw an invisible ripple spreading out in all directions with Brando as the center. It was like a drop of water falling on the surface of the water, creating a circle of ripples. However, between the peaks and troughs of the ripple, there were flashing silver threads of the law. This net-like structure swept across all the huts near and far. It felt as if the huts had turned into a net-like structure for a moment, only to return to their original state in an instant. The future Black Lord of Madara was a little stunned as he looked at the scene. "The will has taken form." He then shouted again, "How far do you plan to spread this thing?" Sursta quickly bared his teeth because he had seen the layout of the port before. According to the speed of the ripple's spread, it had probably swept across half of the port by now. He wanted to remind Brando that there might be supreme-class existences among them, and it was unlikely that they would not notice such a spying, but it was a little too late now. At this time he kept his mouth shut because he believed that Brando was not a reckless person. If a guy with a brain full of muscles could force him and Tarkus to such a state, they might as well find a piece of tofu and kill themselves. Brando did not move. Just as the Sursta dragon had expected, the domain weaved by his lines of law quickly covered most of the harbor. He had thought of this method less than an hour ago when he used his dark perception to eavesdrop on the conversation between the other party and Tarkus. He just integrated it into his own extreme planes. Now it seemed that the effect was better than he imagined. Within a radius of a few miles, everything seemed to be included in his perception. He had never experienced such a feeling before. The conversations and whispers of hundreds of people here were as if they were in his ears. It should have been very noisy, but in his perception it was very clear. It was as if he could extract a voice or a conversation with just a thought. This was definitely not something that could be done by humans. Brando himself was shocked. His original intention was to explore what the hell was in the port, but he did not expect this feeling to make him feel like an omniscient and omnipotent god. In fact, he was very familiar with this ability to filter and search the content of the conversation. Wasn't this the remote chat system in the Amber Sword? He now had a feeling that he had forced his way into a regional chat channel, and it was a private channel, and he had quietly gained administrator authority. Brando almost instantly understood that this was definitely his strange system helping him. With just a thought, he could monitor almost all the conversations related to himself in this area. In fact, he had heard several conversations mentioning the outsider, Huang Hua, and Mr. Liu. The outsider was obviously himself. He was about to continue listening, but he found that his vision seemed to be stretched, and he suddenly saw the scene in the port area. He saw several guys wearing black fire patterns and loose robes with long sleeves gathered in 2s and 3s. Several people who were obviously the leaders were commanding them to surround a warehouse. In the open space outside the warehouse, some other people were drawing a huge magic circle. There seemed to be something in the center of the magic circle, but an unfamiliar law blocked his observation, making him unable to get close. He turned his gaze and saw that there were 3 people around the spirit array who were raising their heads. 2 of them stood next to the magic circle, and the other person was in an inconspicuous corner of the crowd. Lu Yin immediately understood what was going on. Sure enough, there were 3 limeters or some who were half a step into the limeters. He was not too surprised that he was detected by the other party. If the Supreme Class Masters did not even know that they were being spied on, then they did not live up to their name. After reaching the Supreme Class, one's own law would automatically form a domain around the body. Often, once spied on in any form, it would automatically react, either counterattack or remind oneself depending on the nature of the element. In Wand, this ability was called the Law Barrier. It was actually an upgraded version of the Will Barrier. In 9 Phoenix it was called Heavenly Perception. Brando almost immediately felt 3 counterattacks stabbing in his direction. 2 of these counterattacks came from the spiritual world, and 1 from the elemental world. He secretly cursed. These Supreme Class Masters of the Ghost Chariot were too extreme. They did not even have a single defensive element, and they were all so irritable. In the past, he would not have been able to do anything about these counterattacks and could only take them head-on. However, in that way the other party would obviously be able to detect his presence. However, ever since he asked about the mystery of the Heavenly Eye of Phoenix Fire, all of this was no longer a problem. The Heavenly Eye of the Jade Phoenix clan came from the interaction between humans and nature. Of course, this was what the 9 Phoenix said. The people of Wand liked to call the law the Heavenly Way, which was also the way of nature. The 9 Phoenix sword emphasized the way of the unity of man and nature. Of course, Wand also had the same concept when he was in the later stages of the Saint Domain and had a perfect body. However, the people of Wand preferred to talk about this in terms of laws and elements. The actual function of the Heavenly Eye was to control one's surrounding law. However, it was not only to control the law lines around one's body, but also to use one's own law to invade the other party's territory. From there, one could learn some information about the other party and their movements. Unlike Vaunt, who regarded the extreme planes as his own domain, or territory, the 9 Phoenixes paid more attention to the offensive nature of the extreme planes. When Marshal Blank used the Mirror Still Water of the White Raven Sword technique to force him to withdraw the lines of law, and then took the initiative to attack, it was actually a method of application influenced by this 9 Phoenix's ideology. Therefore at that time he was flustered. Rather than saying that he was inexperienced, it was more accurate to say that he had never encountered such a fighting style before. It was inevitable that he found it difficult to deal with. The 9 Phoenix people's way of using the law was not unique to the Jade Phoenix clan. In fact, he had already formed a widespread recognition, just like how the people of Wand recognized their own fighting style. However, the Jade Phoenix clan's Heavenly Eye went further on this path, and their control of the law lines was also more refined. This ability was not a big secret to the 9 Phoenix royal family. In fact, several sword factions that had a good relationship with the Jade Phoenix clan had more or less learned the mystery of the Heavenly Eye. Even within the Ghost Chariot, the Heavenly Eye was not a big secret. Therefore, when Brando asked, Phoenix Hood did not hesitate and told him everything. After understanding how this ability was used, it was too easy for Brando to replicate it with his strength. In fact, it was not only that. He realized that the 9 Phoenix people's way of thinking was quite compatible with his own law and element. When the spacetime element was used with this idea, it might be able to produce unexpected results. Just like what he was doing now. He did not care about the 3 Supreme Class elites probing. Instead, he directly used his ability to invade the law network in the port area. He used the spacetime element to trace back time and directly wiped out the existence of his own law lines. At that moment, the 3 Supreme Class elites of the Ghost Chariot were stunned. They raised their heads and looked about them with a puzzled expression. Just a moment ago, they felt as if someone was spying on the situation in the port area through the law domain. They also tried to counterattack in that direction. But it was only for a moment, and that abrupt feeling disappeared. It was not because the other party had retracted the law lines, but it was as if they had never existed. They felt as if their previous perception was an illusion. In fact, after they spread out their law domains, they received the same information. It really seemed to be an illusion. Meanwhile, in the shack area a few miles away, the Insursta dragon was staring dumbfoundedly at a few lines of law sweeping across the void. They seemed to be aimlessly shooting through the air, and then there was no more news. What elemental ability is this? He asked subconsciously. He had never heard that his nomological perception could be deceived and missed. Brando turned around and smiled at him. Of course it's something good. He was actually even more satisfied. There was nothing more real in this world than the law. For a Supreme Class elite, your law would never deceive you, and they would not be deceived by the law of others. But there was an exception. That was, the other party's prying had never existed. When he used the law of spacetime to trace back time, his prying was in the state of not happening to the other party's law. Since it had not happened, it obviously did not exist. So it was not a lie. Brando had been trying to figure out how to use the law after he learned about the 9 Phoenixes method. He had guessed a way to use it on the way here, but he did not expect that after experimenting, the actual effect was much better than he had imagined. Everything before their eyes was proof of that. Seeing that Insursta still did not quite understand, he did not intend to explain. He only said to the other party, "I saw something in the port area." Insursta was stunned for a moment before he realized what Brando was talking about. He asked, "What is it?" "It's a magic circle, but that magic circle shouldn't be targeted at us. There's something inside that magic circle, and that magic circle seems to be prepared to protect that thing. Unfortunately, the law around that thing is of a higher level than mine, so I can't see what it is clearly. I can only vaguely see that it's a sword." "A sword?" Insursta asked. "That thing's law is of a higher level than yours, sir. I'm afraid that your law's level is not low either." Brando nodded. He was actually also thinking about this problem. The spacetime element was already at the level of existential power. In theory, there should not be any element of a higher level than the spacetime element. If there was no difference in quality, then only quantity was left. In other words, the other party's element level was existential at least, and the total amount was stronger than his own. What was that thing? The first thing he thought of was naturally the sacred sword, but then he shook his head. Because ever since he completed the trial of the majestic mountain at the elemental barrier, he had a faint connection with the sacred swords, and that sword obviously did not give him such a feeling. Of course, he could not rule out the possibility that it was isolated by that magic circle. "In any case," Brando replied, "we'll know when we see it. P.S. The news about the audit has been spreading like wildfire recently. Amber doesn't seem to have received the notice yet, but I'm full of integrity. It seems that I won't die if I don't actively seek death. For the next book, I've decided to write a female protagonist. This way, I won't even have to give the protagonist a cheat. As long as the enemy attacks a position other than the protagonist's hand, it will be neutralized. Thinking about it this way, I'm still a genius after all." Chapter 1243. Inside warehouse number 14, Mr. Liu was holding his sword with one hand and sitting on a few wooden boxes. His right hand was wrapped in a white cloth that was speckled with dark red spots. He used the cloth to wrap his hand and the sword hilt together. Not far from him, a few corpses dressed in ghost chariot costumes were crawling in front of the door. Since then, no one dared to break in. But he knew in his heart that the other party was only afraid of the ancient phoenix jade pendant in his hands. Not to mention that the 3 elders of Ghost Chariot were outside. As long as they completed the ritual of worshipping the sacred jade sword, he would be doomed. The people of Ghost Chariot even summoned the sacred jade sword, then presumably Fang Qi should also be nearby. Mr. Liu's heart sank. It was just as the young man from Won said. The other party must have been preparing here for a long time. The news must have been leaked when they turned from Madara. Even if there was no starfall, he and Huang Huo would have been caught by the other party in Madara. He was careless. I only hope that the young man can protect Mississippi, he thought to himself. Once again he stood up from the wooden box with the sword in his hand. The aura of the sacred jade sword outside was becoming more and more obvious. Even if he was in the warehouse, he could faintly feel the faint sound of a dragon's roar coming from outside. He was ready to sacrifice himself, but the people of Ghost Chariot outside were still biding their time. The third elder raised his snow-white eyebrows and retracted his gaze from the sky. The previous flash of vigilance made him feel vaguely uneasy. But even so, he still chose to believe in his domain of law. A person's habits accumulated over hundreds of years were very scary. As long as one was not an obsessive-compulsive disorder patient, a normal person would not repeatedly check whether they had locked the door or not. Besides, the three elders of Ghost Chariot were separated. Otherwise, they might have discovered that the three of them had an illusion at the same time and would probably be more vigilant. Third elder was not in a hurry to attack the warehouse. Lu Wu would not be able to escape anyway. Mr. Lu was ranked 5th in the Lu family in this generation. Those who respected him called him Mr. Lu, but his enemies would not call him that. Third elder was very clear about this person's bad temper. He knew that the other party would not surrender. He did not plan to let his subordinates go in and be the scapegoat for the other party. The ancient Phoenix Jade Pendant was an ancient sacred object. It was one of the few objects left behind from the legendary Eastern Dynasty. Just like Won's history, the history of the Nine Phoenix had been destroyed several times. The Nine Phoenix Dynasty was also built on the ruins of the previous civilization, including the White Raven, Desert Wind, and the Three Great Swords, and even the Nine Phoenix's most mysterious legendary jadeite riddle. They were all relics of the previous era. The ancient Phoenix Jade Pendant, which also came from that era, was extremely powerful. If that person did not hesitate to sacrifice himself to summon the ancient Phoenix spirit, it was not impossible to burn Luo Celine to the ground. It was a pity that the other party was wary of the young lady of the Jade Phoenix clan who was still in the city. Otherwise this battle would not have been so easy. He turned around and saw a green jade sword taking shape in the center of a purple magic array on the plaza at the dock. He immediately calmed down and turned around to shout into the warehouse. Lu Bai, in the past, Ghost Chariot and Jade Phoenix were of the same bloodline. They fought because of differences in ideology. Now that we are in danger, there is hope for the revival of our Ghost Chariot bloodline. Why not persuade the Jade Phoenix bloodline to summon the heart of the Azure Dragon with us and restore the glory of the Nine Phoenix dynasty for thousands of years? The third elder was full of energy. His voice echoed in the air above the harbor for a long time. Unfortunately, the warehouse was silent and there was no response. This damn diehard. Although he already knew the result, he could not help but stare at him and curse in his heart. Since you want to die, I will fulfill your wish. He turned around in exasperation and bowed to the summoning magic array. He shouted, "Holy Sword, please descend." At the same time, two other voices resounded from different locations of the square. A dazzling cyan light descended from the sky. Falling vertically from the sky, it steadily landed on the illusory image of the sacred jade sword in the center of the formation. The crowd in the plaza suddenly exclaimed. Even the third elder could not help but raise his eyebrows. The Jade Dragon Holy Sword was also a relic of the previous dynasty. In the era when Ghost Chariot was still in charge of the Nine Phoenix, this sword was once the symbol of the entire Nine Phoenix. In that era, even in the War of the Dynasty, the Ghost Chariot family rarely used this sacred object. To be able to see the Holy Sword once in his life, even if it was just a fractal, he was extremely excited. The Holy Sword had awakened from its slumber. His generation could finally see the revival of the Ghost Chariot bloodline. Just as the third elder and the Ghost Chariot people in the plaza were extremely excited. In the forest not far away from Rosaline's castle, Delphian was also staring at this green light. This light column was reflected in her light purple eyes for a long time, making her gaze seem somewhat deep. Fang Qi stood beside her with a smile and said, "How is it, Miss Delphian? I heard that the people of Wonde have a sacred object called the Azure Lance." It was the lance of the Azure Knight who opened up the mortal era. The Nine Phoenix also has the same history. The Jade Dragon Holy Sword was the pioneer of the era before the Nine Phoenix. It has a similar legend with the heart of the Azure Dragon. In our history, the owner of the Jade Dragon Holy Sword is the king of the Nine Phoenix. Seeing that Delphian was staring blankly in that direction without replying, He scratched his head in distress and said, "Well, Miss Delphian, did you hear what I said?" Only then did Delphine come back to her senses. The azure light indeed reminded her of something. However, the light column that descended from the sky reminded her of the dazzling light that she saw that night in the loop of trade winds. In the darkness of that civilization, a solitary beam swayed in the wind and rain. It was as if time had turned back thousands of years, and the bonfire that the ancestors had lit in the wilderness, unyieldingly announcing the birth of the empire. The history of the mortals had never been smooth sailing. The ancient kings had walked through thorns, and the path that they opened up with sword and fire in the ignorance was definitely not a bright and smooth path now. She glanced at Fang Qi and replied indifferently, "How ambitious are you?" Ah, Fang Qi's expression turned solemn. He looked at the light with some yearning and muttered, "Very ambitious, Miss Delphian. I believe that I belong to this era. My heart can accommodate this vast world. How about it, are you willing to be with me?" "Haha," Delphian smiled slightly, "you are far inferior to him." "Oh, you will know in a while." The Prime Minister's daughter replied softly, as if she was talking about a guessing game. The moment the azure light rose, Brendel felt the vibrations of the elements of nature and wind in his body. This was unique. The laws of the elemental orb and the holy sword had always been in a stable state in his body, and he could not detect them at all. The only time he had such a feeling before was when he was inside the elemental barrier. When the talent of the chosen one that Martha gave him appeared, all the elements resonated with him. But the rising light column also gave him a sense of familiarity. The feeling was exactly the same as when he first felt the holy lance of heaven. Brando could not help but be shocked. He immediately realized that the thing in the magic circle was a sacred object that was not inferior to the azure lance. Although he already knew that the azure lance was not the only sacred object in the world when he was inside the elemental barrier, it was the amber sword that belonged to the era of the azure knight. Then, before or even after that, there must be something similar on the earth, but he did not expect to encounter it in this place so soon. It was a sacred object of nature and wind, and it existed in the form of a sword. Brando immediately understood. He knew that the azure lance was also a sacred object of the wind, and was the owner of the power of the earth and wind. If this sword existed before the azure lance, then its power of wind should no longer exist, but it was very likely that it still had the power of nature left. Especially when he already knew that the heart of the azure dragon was the orb of nature, and it was likely to be near the nine-headed phoenix. He just did not know if the power contained in this sword came from the verdant sword. But no matter what, Brendel's interest was piqued as soon as the item appeared. He did not even dream that there would be such a pleasant surprise. He could not help but wonder if he had used up all his luck for the next few decades. He clearly remembered that back in the game he and Senior Baijia were known as the twin demons of the dark wind. Not to mention the additional drops, even the fixed loot would often be bugged by Senior Baijia, causing her to lose everything. Thinking of this, he could not help but prepare to attack, but before that he looked back at Insursta and reminded him, "Mr. Insursta, you're not thinking of taking the opportunity to escape, are you? Count, you're insulting my character. You're an undead. Undead have personalities too." Brando nodded and signaled with his eyes that this guy better not run around. Although it was difficult to escape from Rosaline in such a short time, he did not want to cause trouble for himself. Then he activated the spatial element, and disappeared in front of Insursta in a flash. The next thing he knew, he had already appeared in the port 1,000 meters away. However, he still did not choose to take off, but went around the back of the square through the intricate roads between the warehouse areas. Previously, he had scanned the entire port, and in addition he knew the layout of the port like the back of his hand, so it was easy to not alarm the three elders of the Phantom Chariot. Moreover, at this moment, almost everyone in the Phantom Chariot was attracted by the descent of the Holy Sword. When Brando arrived at the square, no one noticed that there was an extra person between them. Chapter 1244. Brando did not expose them. He stood silently in the crowd and looked up at the beam of green light. At the same time, his eyes were trying to determine the original position of the three elders. But it was at this moment that a sudden high-pitched dragon roar resounded through the sky, attracting everyone's attention. Brando was no exception. In his stunned gaze, he saw an eastern dragon that he had often seen in historical myths in his previous life rising from the misty green light. The dragon was several hundred meters long. It slowly emerged from the green light pillar and spiraled upwards. Although it could be seen that it was only a shadow in an energy state, its hair and beard were all fluttering. It was so vivid that no one would think that it was just an illusion. What's more, before Brendel even got close, he could already feel the immense pressure from the terrifying magic ripples emanating from the other party's huge body. That pressure clearly did not come from the phantom, but from its main body in the magic formation below, which was the sword itself. Brando was secretly shocked. This was definitely a sacred object that was no less than the azure lance, and this holy sword seemed to be completely unsealed, almost the same as it was in its heyday. The only difference was that it did not have the fate blessing from the amber sword. It was a completely different concept from the holy lance in Scarlet's hand that had just been unsealed, but the mountain girl obviously did not have the ability to master such a powerful weapon. This was definitely the power of existence. The pressure made Brando's hair stand on end. He was a little surprised that there was someone among the mortals in the present world who could control such power. But he only took a glance at the center of the square and understood. No one was controlling the holy sword. The reason it could be activated was because of the magic circle. He had never heard of the way the 9 phoenixes used a sacred object. It seemed that although the other party paid attention to swordsmanship, he obviously had his own unique views on magic. At least this magic circle was something that he had seen in Wand. Even in the literature of the Bugas, the craftsman mages, there was nothing similar. Interesting. Brando thought to himself. If someone could master this sword, he would definitely turn around and leave. Although Mr. Liu was still trapped in the warehouse, he obviously had to act according to his ability to save people. The power of this sword at this moment was not inferior to that of the sage. If someone could master it, they would have to at least have a perfect body. Such an existence, not to mention now, even in his heyday in the amber sword, he might not be a match for the other party. It was almost equivalent to fighting the Azure Knight head-on. Brando did not think he had any chance of winning. Not to mention him, even the strongest players among the players would probably be sent to their deaths. But it was different now. The holy sword was an ownerless object in the magic circle. If he could get rid of the elders of the phantom chariot in the shortest time possible, then it would not be impossible to seize the sword. Brando's eyes quickly locked on the guy furthest away from the magic circle, but he did not immediately make a move. Instead, he waited for the right time. After all, the other party was a supreme class existence. Even if they were not as good as him, it was impossible for him to crush them one by one. If he was held back by any one of them, he would buy time for the others to summon the holy sword to attack him. That would be fun. Brando was waiting. Since the other party summoned the holy sword at this time, it was obvious that they were up to something. Mr. Liu was the only one in the warehouse. Brando did not think that the other party needed to let 3 supreme class masters use such a holy sword. It was a bit too outrageous to describe the current situation as using a sledgehammer to kill a chicken. So there was only one possibility, and that was that Mr. Liu also had something that these people were afraid of. The other party was waiting for the moment Mr. Liu summoned that thing. That would be the best opportunity for him to make a move. Brando was not wrong. In fact, he did not have to wait for too long. In almost a moment, he heard the same clear cry of a phoenix coming from the warehouse. Then he watched as a ball of fire burned out of the warehouse. Almost instantly, the roof of the warehouse turned into a sea of fire. A phoenix covered in green flames flew out of the sea of fire with a cry. The moment it flew out, it spread its wings that were originally closed. The green wings that were nearly 100 meters long immediately enveloped the entire harbor area. The buildings in the harbor, as well as the sailboats that were docked in the harbor, started to burn out of thin air. Even Brando, who was hundreds of meters away, felt a wave of heat hit him in the face. He could not help but curse in his heart. Although he did not know what the hell summoned this phoenix, the green flames on its body were not inferior to the power of the golden flames. It was also the highest level of fire elemental element. The top-level fire elemental element was only second to the power of existence. Brando suddenly felt that the 9 Phoenix was too abnormal. He had not been here for long, and he had already encountered such a top-level existence again and again. It was no wonder that the Amber Sword listed this place as one of the highest-level areas, and it was not open to ordinary players until the later stages of the game. However, he did not hesitate at all. Just as the blue phoenix flew towards the dragon in the air, he also sped towards his target at the first moment. How fast could he reach with the power of the Supreme Realm and the support of the spatial element when he activated the charge skill? Brando had never specifically calculated this question, and in fact, this was the first time he used this combination of skills in the main material plane. That was the truth. Elder Ghost Car, who was half a step into the Supreme Realm, did not react at all. Since Brando chose him as the target, it was obvious that he was the weakest of the 3. And it was indeed so. Even the third elder, who was closest to the magic circle, reacted first, while the latter was still unaware of the danger. Be careful. When the third elder saw Brando, he was so scared that his heart almost stopped. What kind of speed was that? Even his eyes almost could not catch the other party's trace. However, when he shouted this warning, he already knew in his heart that he had actually made a wrong choice. This was because he realized that his warning had no effect at all. That person's speed had clearly surpassed the speed of sound in the air. He even saw a white cloud cone appear in front of the tip of Brando's sword that he pulled out. Brando's sword was extremely accurate. It was swordsmanship that was forged through decades of risking life and death. It could be said that there was no warrior in the world who was more desperate than the players. They were not even indifferent to life and death but despised it. Life and death were just a piece of data to them, so almost no one knew how to fight for their lives better than the players. In this life, after stepping into the elemental realm and completely dispelling the fear of death, Brando completely inherited the gift from the other soul in his body. He even went one step further. His sword was like a gleaming razor. Under the elder's astonished gaze, his sword slashed across his neck, taking away a large head. On the other hand, his opponent's subconscious attack had only left a deep cut on his chest. Brando did not dodge or evade because he did not want to give the elder any chance. The elder's attack was also from the supreme realm, but in fact, it could only break through his defense. The terrifying defense of the Templar Knight was evident. On the contrary, the damage rebound from the blood of the scorching sun left a few deep wounds on the elder's body. It only took a moment. The elder's corpse had already fallen to the ground, blood spurting out like arrows. Almost everyone in the square was stunned. In the warehouse, Mr. Liu, who had burned almost half of his life force to summon the ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet, his originally black hair had turned white. He was about to draw his sword and fight to his death, but he was also stunned. His strength was even weaker than the third elder of the ghost chariot outside. Although he was slightly better than the ordinary ghost chariot sect members outside, in fact, he only had time to see the seventh elder of the ghost chariot turn around. As for how Brando appeared, he realized that he had no idea at all. It was as if he had appeared out of thin air. He saw Brando withdraw his sword, and the seventh elder of the ghost chariot fell to the ground. Then, as soon as his feet touched the ground, he turned around and killed another elder of the ghost chariot not far away. Oh no! Mr. Liu was shocked. Be careful, Mr. Brando. Seeing this scene, he wanted to warn him, but he made the same mistake as the third elder. Because in a battle at their level, sound might not be faster than one's own speed. This was why in the supreme realm of Wand, even the warriors often knew a little bit of magic. Because at this level of cooperation, only magic was more reliable. In fact, as soon as Brando turned around, he already felt that something was wrong. Because the moment Elder Ghost Chariot fell to the ground, he immediately turned into a headless puppet. Substitute mysterious item? Brando was shocked. Although there were also things like Cypher's heart and Angel's heart vase in Wand, these things were extremely rare, and not just any Supreme Realm Master could have them. He was really shocked by the wealth of the people of Nine Phoenix. If this guy was the only one with a substitute strange item, he would just consider himself unlucky to have chosen the wrong opponent to attack first. But if all three of them had the same thing, he was afraid that this trip would be a little dangerous. Just as Brando was hesitating, he heard Mr. Liu's warning from behind. Mr. Liu obviously would not speak without thinking, so he immediately confirmed his guess. It seemed that these three Ghost Chariot elders all had substitute strange items. Brendel immediately cursed inwardly. What the hell is this Nine Phoenix? Even the substitute oddities have become cabbages in the ground? Chapter 1245. The Ghost Chariot did not enter the Nine Phoenix, and the Nine Phoenix did not leave the Cloud Ridge. The Cloud Ridge was the Green Jade Hill. For many years, the Ghost Chariot had treated the Swift Plains as its base. It had infiltrated the Nine Phoenix's forces like a sieve. More than a century ago, the Ghost Chariot's leader had ambushed and killed the Tiger Claw Grand Sword Master on the Pipa Plateau. After that, it caused a bloody war that lasted for more than 20 years. To this day, the Ghost Chariot and the Tiger Claw sect were still feuding families. Their hatred for each other even exceeded the hatred between the Jade Phoenix and the Ghost Chariot. After that, the Eight Sword sect had a tradition of Grand Sword Masters not leaving the country. This was actually because of the vigilance brought by this incident. Although the Grand Sword Masters were powerful, it was also difficult for them to fight against schemes and plots. Moreover, the Ghost Chariot's forces were deeply rooted on both sides of the Tawu Strait. The two sides seemed to have formed a tacit understanding. For the next half a century, the ghost chariot had become used to controlling everything on the swift plains. In addition, the Nine Phoenixes' forces had weakened in recent years, and it was gradually becoming more powerful. The people in the ghost chariot gradually became arrogant. If not for this, they would not have targeted the patrolling empress. If it was 30 years ago, the slightly conservative ghost chariot would definitely not have thought of contacting the Roman Tuo's Black Rose. Therefore, the more backward they were, the more conservative they were. This was an irrefutable truth. However, the third elder did not expect that just like 7 or 8 years ago, the plan that was almost certain to deal a heavy blow to the Nine Phoenix Kingdom and even cause the Jade Phoenix clan to be unable to recover from this setback had an accident at the last minute. There was actually someone who dared to interfere with the ghost chariot's matters on both sides of the Taowu Strait. The first thought in his mind was anger. This anger came without any reason. So what if it was a Grand Sword Master? It was not like the ghost chariot had not dealt with such people before. The Tiger Claw Grand Sword Master's fate back then was a clear proof. At that time, the Nine Phoenix could not do anything to the Swift Plains. Otherwise, its influence on the Taowu Strait would not have declined so much. He did not know about Phoenix Fire's promise to Lord Rosaline. Otherwise, he would have mocked her in his heart. The Nine Phoenix royal family only dared to make such a promise now. If it was 150 years ago, they only needed to say that they would protect Rosaline, and the Rosaline family would not do anything. What enemies and monsters could do to them. The current Nine Phoenix was no longer the Nine Phoenix of the past, and the current ghost chariot was no longer the loser who had lost his soul. What a fool. What are you still standing there for? Hurry up and surround him. The third elder roared. Ghost Chariot's people, who were still shocked by Brando's soul-stirring sword and the amazing scene in the sky, finally reacted. They came back to their senses, drew their long swords and surrounded him. Originally there were 40 to 50 people in the square. More than half of them were above the gold level, and the rest had stepped into the elemental realm. Ghost Chariot and the Jade Phoenix were of the same lineage, and some of their ancient traditions had been passed down since the founding of the Nine Phoenix Empire. They were similar. After Ghost Chariot was defeated and left the Nine Phoenix Empire, he did not leave these traditions behind. This included the tradition of letting the elites of the Nine Phoenix Empire travel and gain experience, just like the Nine Phoenix Empire's tour. Therefore, these elites who had been traveling and gaining experience on the Swift Plains all year round were far more experienced than the old knight like Rosaline. Even if they were both at the gold level, their quality was not on the same level. These people were stunned, but once they came back to their senses, they almost immediately chose the most correct strategy. Stop him. Be careful, this person is very fast. Let's surround him and don't give him any space to display his skills. Those of the celestial realm, form a sword array with me, and disturb his mind from behind. Previously, Brando had beheaded the seventh elder with one sword. Although it was inevitable that it was a sneak attack and luck, it was enough to let these people understand the gap between them and Brando. They knew in their hearts that the threat they posed to Brando could be said to be negligible, but there were still 3 other supreme-level elders present. In a situation where it was 3 against 1, no matter how strong Brando was, it would be inevitable for him to be overwhelmed, right? In a battle between elites, victory and defeat was often decided by a thin line, so they did not need to affect Brando too much. They only needed to distract Brando slightly. These people did not think that Brando could fight 1 against 3, but they could see that Brando's abilities were at least above the 7th Elder and the 11th Elder. He was probably on par with the 3rd Elder, who was the strongest present, so they did not hope to determine the outcome of the battle. At least, it was enough to prevent the 7th Elder and the 11th Elder from being injured. Especially since the 7th Elder did not have a second substitute rare item. Naturally, Ghost Chariot did not have 70 or 80 elders to die on the battlefield. These thoughts were formed in an instant, but they were definitely not spontaneous. In the entire Nine Phoenix, in terms of experience in dealing with Greatsword Saints, if Ghost Chariot claimed to be second, no one would dare to claim to be first. After all, although Ghost Chariot had one of the 3 supreme swords, Nine Phoenix also had Jade Phoenix and White Raven, not to mention the other 6 swords supporting the royal family. Although Nine Phoenix was in decline now and Ghost Chariot itself was showing signs of resurgence, compared to the 8 supreme sword sects, it would never think that the absolute number of great sword saints could surpass the Nine Phoenix Kingdom. Therefore, since a long time ago, Ghost Chariot had been studying how to deal with this absolute gap in strength. The plan to ambush and kill the great sword saint of the Tiger Claw sect a century ago could be said to be to seize the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to weaken the strength of the Nine Phoenix Kingdom. It was also a rehearsal of this long-term strategy. Now, the experience from 150 years ago, after fermenting over time, had come true on Brando. The latter had originally planned to end the battle quickly, but he did not expect that the other party would have something similar to Cypher's heart. This was really a huge trap, and it completely ruined his original plan, forcing him to face such a fact. That meant he had to face a head-on battle, and he had to face the threat of the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword at all times. Plans really can't keep up with changes. Facing the ghost chariot gang that surrounded him, Brando actually had the mood to mock himself in his heart. Mr. Liu, who was rushing out of the warehouse, saw this scene and secretly cursed. If he could, he would rather Brando take the young lady and run away. Although in his opinion Brando might be a rare master, it was a little whimsical to think that he could fight against 3 Supreme Realm Masters alone. 100 years ago, the great sword saint of the Tiger Claw sect was also a master at that time. What happened to the latter? What's more, he saw the people on the field clearly. Except for the guards close to the golden circle, the rest of the people were all masters. Some of them were even stronger than him. It could be seen that the Ghost Chariot gang's arrangement in Rosaline was very thorough. They were determined to keep him and the young lady here. He secretly hated Madara's undead for meddling in the affairs of the Nine Phoenix. At the same time, he made up his mind. Even if the spirit of the ancient Phoenix was hit by the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword, he would let it attack the Ghost Chariot gang at the port below. At least, he would create a chance for Brando to kill his way out. He had seen the speed of the other party's sword earlier. He believed that if they just wanted to escape, these people should not be able to stop the young man. The only chance now is to let this person take the young lady and escape. Although the hope is slim, at least it's better than waiting for death. He silently calculated in his heart. But as Brando said, plans could not keep up with changes. Just as Mr. Liu made up his mind, there were unexpected changes on the scene. Everyone from the Ghost Chariot gang surrounded him confidently. They thought that the battle from 1.5 centuries ago would reappear today. After all, even if the young man in front of them was at the level of a Grand Sword Saint, he could not be compared to the Tiger Claw Grand Sword Saint who was over 50 years old at his peak, right? What's more, at that time the Ghost Chariot gang only sent out 2 Supreme Masters. Now there were 2 here, and the Jade Imperial Sacred Sword was in the air. But before the 3 elders had time to make a move, Brando had already made his move. He did not draw his sword. In fact, it was impossible to kill all these people at once even if he drew his sword. Whether it was the 9 luminary sword art or flash strike sword art, they were all in the category of swordsmanship. There were still 3 elders from the Ghost Chariot gang staring at him. Brando was not arrogant enough to think that he could fight against 3 of them at once. On the contrary, he used a more direct way. Using force to oppress people, Brando suddenly stopped. He did not even look at the puppet that had fallen to the ground behind him. It was as if he did not care whether the 7th elder, who had been cut down by his sword, was dead or alive. He only held his sword and looked back. His serious gaze swept across the port square. A layer of fine and dense net-like silver brilliance appeared in the space, causing everyone's momentum to stagnate. The power of a Lemmeter surged out like a tidal wave, and the 3 elders were shocked. They had never dreamed that a junior would dare to use the extreme planes in front of them, and in such an unreasonable manner. It was almost as if he didn't have any defensive measures in place. This feeling was exactly the same as when Brando dealt with him. Even if the 3 elders from the Ghost Chariot gang were from the 9 Phoenixes, they still caught Brando off guard. Then they exploded with anger. Especially the 3rd elder. In his opinion, this young man was simply provoking them. Although it was common knowledge that the 9 Phoenixes used the power of precepts to take the initiative to attack, it also depended on who was facing whom. If a guy whose elemental level and absolute strength were weaker than his opponent took the initiative to use the power of precepts to attack the opponent, what was this if not courting death? At least in the eyes of the 3 elders, Brando was courting death. Not to mention that Brando's young age made the 3rd elder look down on him. In his opinion, even if the opponent's strength might be in the realm of a great sword saint, or even surpass the 7th and 11th elder, it was not enough in front of him. Chapter 1246. After all, one's strength was related to one's age. Even if Brando was the chosen one and had been practicing the sword since he was in his mother's womb, how much strength could he have? The genius of the Ghost Chariot, Fang Qi, was known as a once-in-a-millennium genius, but at his age he was far from being a match for these elders. Not to mention that he was fighting 1 against 3. Therefore, Brando's action was a naked mockery. Not only was it completely out of their expectations, but they also knew very well that no matter what Brando was going to do next, at least their subordinates were going to be in big trouble. This was all because of their negligence. How could the three elders not be angry? Therefore they opened up their extreme planes almost immediately. They wanted to save as many people as possible before Brando's extreme planes enveloped the ghost chariot troop around him. At the same time they completely opened up their strength, planning to teach this arrogant young man a painful lesson. At this time, even the seventh elder who had been heavily injured by Brando and had used a substitute artifact to escape the disaster could not help but jump out again. Together with his two companions, he opened up his extreme planes that had not been fully formed. Brendel turned around abruptly and met the man's ferocious gaze. If one time is not enough, then let's do it again. You don't know the immensity of heaven and earth. The seventh elder's face turned green and white. Although it was true that he had been ambushed, it was also true that as a supreme class expert, he had no room to fight back. Unlike the third elder of the ghost chariot, he only thought that the opponent's method was despicable and the speed was strange. He was caught off guard and did not realize that it was because he was not strong enough. After all, it took some courage to admit that one's strength was not as strong as others. Moreover, he was in existence with an extremely high status in the ghost chariot and had long been used to his high status. Fang Qi raised his wrist and stared at the dark red crystal in his hand. He finally could not help but snort. He turned around and smiled at Delphian. "This is the guy you were talking about?" Delphian looked away from the dragon and phoenix entangled in the sky above Rosaline Harbor. Unlike Brando, she could not recognize the sacred beasts of the 9 phoenixes, but this did not stop her from knowing how terrifying these two monsters were. Even in this direction she could feel the impact of the battle between the two sacred beasts. Not to mention that the harbor had already turned into a hellish scene. Even from far away she could feel waves of scorching heat waves sweeping over. Such a scene made her involuntarily think of Rushta from that day. The most powerful force in the world once again made her feel powerless. The things she was proud of were not worth mentioning in front of these existences. This thought made her look at the man in front of her a little absent-minded, as if she was not listening to what he was saying at all. But that was just a facade. Delphian only stood still for a moment before asking, "What do you want to say?" "Nothing." Fang Qi was also used to her strange way of talking. He smiled proudly. "Your friend may be very strong, but he doesn't seem to have enough brains." "He is not my friend," Delphian corrected coldly. At the same time she replied, "He is a little stupid, but it seems that you are not much better." "Is that so?" Fang Qi shook the red crystal on his wrist like a child. "This person actually dared to barge into the harbor knowing that my men were lying in ambush there. He probably thought that he was already invincible. Unfortunately, he didn't expect that I actually arranged 3 sacred sword masters there. Oh, this time he kicked an iron plate." As he spoke, this guy actually laughed to himself as if he had heard something very funny. 3 sacred sword masters. He must be shocked. Delphian frowned as she looked at this guy. She felt that this guy looked calm and composed on one hand, but sometimes he acted like a child. "What is a sacred sword master?" she asked. Fang Qi replied, "According to what you said, it is the early stage of the Supreme Realm. The peak of the Supreme Realm is either under a saint or a celestial. It is not a level that ordinary people can come into contact with." When he said the second half of the sentence, there was a hint of yearning in his tone. But Delphian smiled at him after hearing this. Fang Qi was stunned. He looked at this woman and felt that her smile was a little strange. It was a fake smile. "What's wrong with you, Miss Delphian?" "Nothing," Delphian replied. "I have the same idea as you, Mr. Fang Qi. Someone might have kicked an iron plate." "Is that so?" After receiving Delphian's approval, the latter seemed a little happy, but he shook his head and said, "Mr. Fang Qi, this name is too strange. According to our tradition here, you should call me Mr. Fang, but I prefer you to call me Fang Qi." Before he finished speaking, the sky suddenly flashed, as if there was a terrible explosion in the direction of Rosaline Harbor. Although there was no sound, a white light swept over from that direction. Fang Qi's words were stuck in his throat. He stared in that direction with his eyes wide open. After a vast white light, the entire Rosaline port disappeared. Looking in that direction from the headland, there was only a huge crater left where the Rosaline port used to be. The seawater quickly flowed in, forming a bright inner lake in the crater. Fang Qi was at a loss for words. What's going on? In fact, this was the question that the ghost chariot's third elder wanted to ask. Of course, all of this started a few minutes ago. When Brando opened up the extreme plane, he and his two companions did not hesitate to open up the extreme plane. After all, he originally thought that Brando attacked the seventh elder because he knew that his strength was not as good as the three of them combined, so he had no choice but to do so. Otherwise, if the other party had the strength, why would he need to launch a sneak attack? Wouldn't he be able to do it openly? But what he did not expect was that Brando just wanted to avoid trouble, not to mention that the sacred jade sword was another concern. At that time, Brando's sneak attack could be said to have succeeded, and they wasted one of their substitution strange items. Substitution strange items were not as cheap as Brando imagined. The ghost chariot had the 13th elder, and only the first 5 people had substitution strange items bestowed by the saints. The 7th elder's substitution strange item was borrowed from someone for this mission to deal with the ancient phoenix jade amulet. Moreover, the substitution strange item was not as magical as imagined. Not to mention that it was an ancient relic, and there was one less substitution strange item. In fact, its substitution strange item overdrew the owner's life as the price. After this battle, the ghost chariot might lose an elder. But he thought that the other party was not without a price, because since the sneak attack did not succeed, then he would have to face their Thunder Fury next. But what he did not expect was that the Thunder Fury would come, but it was not theirs. When they opened up their extreme plane to collide with Brando, they found the problem. The 3 ghost chariots' grand elders realized at the same time that their Lemeter strength was far inferior to this young man's in terms of quality, and even the 3 of them combined were suppressed by him in terms of quantity. What did this mean? The ghost chariot's 3rd elder looked up at Brando in shock. He already knew that the other party had the strength of a great sword saint, and he might be stronger than the 7th elder and the 11th elder. He was prepared for this. But how could the other party be so strong? 3 great sword saints. The ghost chariot's 3 grand elders. Even with their absolute power combined, they were still suppressed by a young man. Could it be that this world was no longer the world they were familiar with? Or was he dreaming and had not woken up yet? The 3rd elder's mind was in a mess, and he could only think of this at the moment. He watched as the ghost chariot's Lemeter strength was fixed in space by Brando's Lemeter strength, and then the latter waved his hand, and these people were silently beheaded like broken puppets. The extreme plane of the 3rd elder and the other 3 were all suppressed in a narrow area, and they could not move. He saw that even after those people's bodies were cut into pieces, they were still fixed in space and did not move at all. The dismembered body parts and blood seemed to be in a world where time was completely still, floating in the air. He only felt a bitter taste in his mouth. The elements of space and time. No matter how slow he was at this moment, he understood what Brando's elements were. However, the ghost chariot's 3rd elder was still a Lemeter after all, and he was not completely stupid. Although almost all of his subordinates were wiped out, Brando's extreme plane was not enough to completely suppress the 3 of them. Don't fight him with the power of law, let's fight him in close combat. 11th elder, don't care about Lu Bai, go control the Jade Dragon sacred sword, we'll buy time for you. As he roared, he pulled out a green jade sword and attacked in Brando's direction. The other 2 elders also reacted immediately. The 11th elder turned and ran, while the 7th elder, who had been seriously injured by Brando earlier, surrounded him from both sides. Brando was most worried about the Jade Dragon sacred sword in the sky, so he naturally would not give them the chance to control the sacred sword. He immediately blocked the 3rd elder's sword. 9 Phoenix's swordsmanship was very different from Won's. The former was more agile and would rarely clash with the opponent's sword. On the other hand, Won's swordsmanship was born from battle formation swordsmanship, and there was a lot of attention to the exchange of swords. Therefore, when the 2 swords clashed, both of them felt a little awkward. Brando was thinking about how the sword was so light that it did not have any force behind it. On the other hand, the 3rd elder was cursing the barbarian in his heart. That sword almost broke his corundum sword. Although the jade sword in his hand looked very fragile, it was also a strange item that was close to the mythical level. It also came from an ancient inheritance, and in terms of hardness, it was not inferior to a steel longsword. However, the long sword in the opponent's hand, which was covered with golden cracks, was like a monster. Every time he clashed with the opponent, he could almost feel the long sword in his hand crying out in grief. With just one sword, the 3rd elder was completely avoided by Brando. He could not help but turn pale with fright. This young man was not inferior to him in terms of absolute strength, but he did not expect that in terms of swordsmanship he was also slightly better than him. Where did this monster come from? Although he was anxious, Brando was even more anxious. The square was not very big to begin with. When the 11th elder turned around, he had almost run to the side of the array that summoned the Jade Dragon's sacred sword. Although the ancient phoenix and the azure dragon were fighting fiercely in the sky, Brando did not have the confidence to take a hit from the Jade Dragon's sacred sword. Chapter 1248. Seeing that the 11th elder was very close to the summoning circle of the Jade Dragon's sacred sword and placed his hand on the circle, he opened his mouth and chanted a few sentences in a language that Brendel could not understand. He only felt that the words were rhythmic and powerful. However, Brando could faintly feel that the 11th elder's breath had suddenly connected with the azure dragon in mid-air. His heart sank as he looked at the 7th elder and the 3rd elder in front of him. Suddenly, he took out an item from the celestial sphere that was hanging in front of his chest. It was an ancient flute with 5 holes and a golden ring at the mouth. It was engraved with ivy and a goddess holding a water bottle. It was Hofward's horn of commendation, which he had obtained from the Termosian. He did not say a word and directly activated the flash strike sword art. Then he used the 9 luminary sword art, one in front and one behind. The 2 figures pierced towards the 3rd elder and the 7th elder at lightning speed. The 2 were so shocked that their eyeballs almost popped out. No, it's not an illusion. Be careful. His attack ignores distance. The 3rd elder felt his hair stand on end. When did such a terrifying person appear in the rain-swallow plains? However, his heart was incomparably calm. The Ironheart School emphasized that the heart was stronger than steel. As a master of the Ironheart School, the closer he was to death, the calmer he would be. He changed from holding the sword with one hand to 2 and summoned the power of the Ironheart in his heart. All the surprise, joy, shock and jealousy from before disappeared without a trace. It was as if the person in front of him was no longer Brando, but just a moving target. He continuously swung the sword in his hand, using the sword blade as a barrier to block the incoming sword. On the other side, Brando was performing the perfect flash strike sword art for the first time. He could clearly feel the harmony between man, sword and space. The obvious feeling of breaking space had completely disappeared, and the sword in his hand was much faster than before. The shining sword blade had completely lost its trajectory. Everyone thought that the Flame King's flash strike sword art described his sword as fast as lightning. Once the sword light was released, it was like a flash of lightning. However, it was only at this moment that Brando understood that the essence of lightning was actually in the flash. It disappeared in a flash as if it had never existed. In the blink of an eye, he had already traversed a distance of several dozen meters. He stabbed out 17 times with Odorfice, and the angle, direction and strength of each attack were all different. Even the 9 luminary sword art was pushed to the extreme by the flash strike sword art. The magic doppelgangers appeared continuously around the 3rd elder, like a continuous blurry shadow wall. But what surprised Brando even more was that under his storm-like attacks, the other party's sword veil didn't budge in the slightest. The clanging sounds of the 2 swords clashing rang out, and sparks splashed down like a waterfall of flames. 17 swords in a row, regardless of whether they came from the front, back, left, or right, the old man in front of him received them all with a cold expression. What surprised him even more was that when he exchanged blows with his opponent earlier, he could clearly feel that his opponent's strength was inferior to his own. But now, after exchanging blows with him consecutively, he could feel a new wave of energy surging out from his opponent's body after every exchange. He didn't recognize the 9 Phoenix's swordsmanship, but if Phoenix Flame was here, she would definitely tell him that this was one of the supreme mysteries of the Ironheart School: iron focus and excellent parry. If the 9 Phoenix swordsmanship was included, the flash strike sword art was undoubtedly the #1 offensive swordsmanship in the world, and the 9 luminary sword art was known for its mysteriousness rather than its strong offensive power. In terms of defensive swordsmanship, the Ironheart sword art should be crowned as the strongest. The locals of the 9 Phoenix swordsmanship called the Ironheart School the Iron Fortress. Mr. Liu stood aside, but the latter couldn't see the confrontation between Brando and the 3rd elder at all, let alone provide any help to the latter. Not to mention that after overdrawing his life to summon the ancient Phoenix Jade Amulet, he was already half kneeling on the ground. The reason he didn't faint was purely because of his tenacious will. However, Brando didn't need any guidance from outsiders. He was a warrior. Things that couldn't be solved by swordsmanship could be solved by other means. Warriors relied on their keen intuition and instinct to win on the battlefield. Level, equipment, terrain, and even morale were all their means of fighting. Brando was no exception. When the flash strike sword art combined with the 9 luminary sword art didn't work, he directly rushed in and pointed his sword at the seventh elder's heart. He didn't care about the sword curtain in the seventh elder's hand. You want to trade injury for injury? The third elder didn't even frown. The mutual destruction swordsmanship might be a threat to others, but it wasn't worth it to deal with the sword saint of the Iron Heart School. With a heart as cold as iron, he directly chose the most effective way to deal with it. He also pointed his sword at Brando's neck, as if he intended to die together with him. If Brando had a plan, then he really wanted to die. Under the state of mind of the Iron Heart School, swordsmen had already disregarded life and death. Of course, Brando wouldn't trade his life with this guy. He didn't even plan to activate the unyielding innate skill because the terrifying green jade sacred sword was still hanging upside down above his head. How could he dare to use his life-saving ability in such a situation? He tilted his head to the side and avoided his opponent's fatal sword. However, he had lost the initiative in the exchange of blows because he had moved first. The third elder also easily avoided Brando's sword, and at the same time seized the opportunity to counterattack. He sneered and pointed his sword at Brando's shoulder. You can avoid the fatal sword, but you have to leave a memento. Otherwise you can go back to where you came from. What he did not expect was that Brendel did not even try to dodge his attack. Instead, Brendel pounced straight at him, allowing his sword to cut into Brendel's left abdomen. A rose-colored mist of blood spurted out from the wound. Then the latter slammed into the third elder's body, sending him flying several times. It seemed that he had gained a lot in this round of confrontation, but when the third elder got up from the ground, he realized that he had made a mistake. The other party didn't want to trade injury for injury, but wanted to trade injury for an escape route. Unfortunately, he was fooled. He immediately heard an ear-piercing scream in his ears. He didn't need to look back to know that the seventh elder was also injured. The latter's strength was weaker than his, and he must have made a mistake in dealing with the previous sword because his heart wasn't as strong as steel. He raised his head and saw the seventh elder kneeling on the ground, clutching his shoulder. Brendel had already killed his way through the two of them, leaving a bloody path behind him. Brando had two serious injuries on his body. One was on the left side of his abdomen, and his black flannel windbreaker was soaked with blood. The other was on his cheek, from his left forehead to his right eye. His eyes were tightly shut and fresh blood dripped down. In fact, he knew that the seventh elder's injury had nothing to do with the other party's strength. The other party probably didn't even dream that he would dare to exchange his sword with him face to face, and wasn't afraid of being beheaded. He was really bold. Of course, Brando wasn't bold. He was just confident in his own defense. Besides, he wanted to end the battle quickly. Once he succeeded, he didn't give the other party any time to react. He immediately jumped forward and passed through the two elders of the ghost chariot. At the same time, he raised the horn of commendation in his hand and poured the golden liquid into his mouth. As soon as the golden liquid entered his mouth, a cool feeling suddenly spread through his limbs and bones. The pain on his face and lower abdomen suddenly lessened, and the bleeding stopped immediately. Although the effect wasn't as terrifying as the angel's heart bottle, the performance of Howard's golden wine was much better than the number 2 holy water. However, Brando's eyes were wide open at this time, and he shouted in his heart. He naturally didn't forget that the golden wine had a strength bonus effect, but he didn't expect the strength bonus effect to come from this. When the wine entered his throat, Brando immediately felt his brain heat up. His vision suddenly tightened, as if he had the illusion that his muscles had swelled up. This feeling was very similar to the feeling he had when he activated the Undead Knight's crystal, but that was instantaneous, while this was a continuous state. The next moment he felt as if his brain had been hit by a heavy hammer. It wasn't that he had been ambushed, or that he had been tricked by the Termosian. It was a state that couldn't be more primitive. He was drunk. Motherf asterisk cur. Brando couldn't wait to drag the Termosian out and beat him up. He didn't even tell him that the wine had side effects. And even if there were side effects, he didn't tell him that the side effects would be so great. Brando only felt that the world was spinning, and there was only one thought left in his mind, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. Damn, the aftereffect of this wine is so strong. He staggered forward. His strength was already far beyond that of a human after stepping into the elemental realm. In fact, the growth of the human body was already maximized after reaching the gold realm. After reaching the elemental realm, the increase in the power of the precepts was more. It was very difficult for the body's attributes to increase by several times, or even dozens of times like before. This could be seen from his own attribute panel. This situation would continue until he reached the perfect body realm. Only then would his body's attributes improve by leaps and bounds. However, it was still far from the leap from the White Realm to the Iron Realm, and then from the Iron Realm to the Silver Realm, and then to the Gold Realm. It could be said that in terms of growth and strength, from the stage of a mortal to the Elemental Realm, mortals were indeed one of the races with the most potential in the whole of Wond. And what did a 25% increase in overall strength mean? It meant that almost all the growth and strength from the Elemental Realm to the late stage of the Precepts, or from the Supreme Realm to the Perfect Body Realm. In other words, Brando's sip of wine was already at the peak of the Sage Realm in terms of strength. He didn't even realize it himself. He only felt dizzy, like a drunkard who loved wine as much as his life. He subconsciously took another sip of wine. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.